The night clung to Dr. Maya Carter like a heavy shroud as she maneuvered her car along the deserted stretch of road. The hum of the engine, her only companion after an 18-hour shift at the hospital. Her eyelids drooped, weighed down by exhaustion that seeped into her bones. But the thought of collapsing into bed kept her hands steady on the wheel. The intricate tattoos tracing across her face as symbols of her heritage, etched with pride, reflected faintly in the dashboard lights, a quiet reminder of who she was. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension of the day unravel, when a sudden flash of red and blue erupted in her rearview mirror. Her stomach twisted, a cold knot forming as she eased the car to the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires. A police cruiser rolled to a stop behind her, its lights casting an eerie glow across the asphalt. She watched in the side mirror as a tall figure emerged, his silhouette sharp and imposing against the night. He approached her window with purposeful strides, his boots thudding against the ground, and rapped on the glass with a knuckle. "License and registration," he snapped, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. No greeting, no sophist, just a demand. His name tag glinted under the dim streetlight. Jack Harris. Maya reached into her glove box, her fingers steady despite the unease blooming in her chest, and handed over the documents. "What's the issue, officer?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with a thread of wariness. Harris didn't glance at the papers. Instead, his gaze zeroed in on her face, lingering on the tattoos with a look that shifted from curiosity to something darker disgust. Thinly masked, "You were speeding," he said flatly, though his eyes betrayed no interest in her driving. He tilted his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Interesting artwork you've got there. What gang do you run with?" The accusation landed like a slap, but Maya straightened in her seat, refusing to flinch. "They're cultural, officer," she replied, her voice firm, each word deliberate. "They have nothing to do with gangs." Harris leaned closer, his breath fogging the window as he aimed his flashlight directly at her face, the beam harsh and blinding. "Cultural, huh?" he sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. "Funny how culture always seems to look like trouble to me." Her jaw tightened, a flicker of anger sparking beneath her calm exterior. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice rising slightly despite her effort to keep it even. "I'd appreciate it if you treated me with some respect." Harris's smirk twisted into a scowl, his eyes narrowing as if her words had struck a nerve. "Respect," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You think you're above the law because you've got some fancy degree. Step out of the car." "Why?" Maya demanded, her pulse quickening as suspicion coiled tighter in her gut. "I said step out." Harris barked, his hand shooting to the door handle. He yanked it open with a force that made the hinges groan, and reluctantly, Maya unbuckled her seatbelt, stepping onto the cold pavement. The night air bit at her skin, but it was Harris's presence, his towering frame looming to closet, that sent a shiver down her spine. He stood inches from her, radiating hostility, his breath visible in the chill as he glared down at her. "People like you," he muttered, his voice thick with disdain, "always think the rules don't apply." Maya's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. "That's not true," she said, her voice trembling with the effort to stay steady. Without warning, Harris's hand clamped around her arm, his grip bruising as he shoved her against the car. "Don't talk back," he growled, his face inches from hers, his eyes wild with something unhinged. "Let go of me," Maya protested, twisting in his grasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Stop resisting," he shouted, though her only resistance was the instinct to pull away. His fist swung down, striking her cheek with a force that exploded pain across her face. The world tilted as she stumbled, her vision blurring, but she shoved him back with every ounce of strength she could muster. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice raw. Harris's response was another blow, this one aimed at the tattoos he'd mocked, as if he could erase them with violence. "You need to learn your place," he hissed, his breath hot against her ear. Maya fought back, her foot connecting with his shin in a desperate kick, but his grip only tightened, unrelenting as iron. Around them, the night stirred. A handful of bystanders had gathered, drawn by the commotion, their phones raised like silent witnesses. "Leave her alone," A voice called from the growing crowd, sharp and indignant. Harris's head snapped toward the sound, his face contorting with rage. But he didn't loosen his hold. With a final shove, he forced Maya to the ground, her head slamming against the pavement. "Consider this your warning," he spat, his voice a low snarl, before turning on his heel and stalking back to his cruiser. The engine roared as he sped off, tires screeching, leaving her sprawled on the asphalt. Pain pulsed through her skull, her cheek throbbing where his fists had landed, and her body trembled with shock and adrenaline. Slowly, she pushed herself up, wincing as her fingers brushed the swelling bruises. The crowd murmured, some stepping closer with tentative offers of help, but their voices felt distant, muffled by the ringing in her ears. As she staggered to her feet, something glinted on the ground, a police badge, its edges sharp and cold. She bent to pick it up, her hands shaking as she turned it over. Above the name Jack Harris was a crest she didn't recognize, its unfamiliar lines stirring a deep unease. Clutching it tightly, she stumbled back to her car, her mind racing. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong, it was personal, vicious, and tied to something bigger. As she drove away, resolve hardened in her chest like steel. Harris had crossed a line, and she wouldn't let it stand. The emergency room doors hissed open as Maya stumbled inside, each step unsteady, her face a throbbing map of pain. Bruises bloomed beneath her skin, dark and angry, and every heartbeat sent a fresh wave of agony through her. A nurse hurried toward her, concern etching her features, but before she could speak, Maya's voice broke the silence. "I was attacked," she said, the words spilling out in a rush. "A police officer." Led to a treatment room, she sank onto the edge of a bed, her hands trembling in her lap. Her phone buzzed insistently, but she ignored it, too consumed by the memory of Harris's fists, his sneering contempt. The door burst open minutes later, and Ethan Carter stormed in, his presence filling the small space, his eyes usually warm and steady where wild with worry, his fists clenched tight at his sides. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice taut, almost breaking as he took in her swollen face, the purpled mark staining her skin. Maya recounted the assault, her words halting but precise, each one heavy with the weight of what she'd endured. "He kept calling my tattoos gang signs," she said, her voice quivering with a mix of rage and disbelief. "Then he hit me, said it was a warning." Ethan paced the room, his movements jerky, his hand raking through his hair as if he could claw the anger out of himself. Unbelievable. He muttered, his voice tight with fury. "A cop did this. He should be behind bars." Maya's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers twisting together. "He's one of their own," she said softly, bitterness lacing her words. "Who's going to hold him accountable?" Ethan stopped pacing and knelt beside her, his hands hovering as if afraid to touch her bruised skin. "We're not letting this slide," he said, his tone fierce, a promise etched into every syllable. The next day, Maya marched into the police station, her steps fueled by a simmering determination. She filled out the complaint forms with meticulous care, detailing every moment of Harris's attacked sneers, the blows, the badge she'd found glinting on the ground. She slid the badge across the desk to the officer on duty, a man whose bored expression barely flickered as she spoke. "We'll look into it," he said, his voice flat, dismissive, as he filed her report without so much as a glance her way. Days passed with no response, each one stretching Maya's patience thinner, until a text lit up her phone screen. "Drop the complaint or you'll regret it." Her chest tightened, fear warring with defiance as she stared at the anonymous threat. The next day, another arrived. "You don't want to make enemies." That evening, she showed the messages to Ethan, her hands shaking as she handed him the phone. His face paled, then hardened with a quiet fury. "They're trying to intimidate you," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "We need to go public with this." Maya's eyes flashed, her frustration boiling over. "And risk everything. What if they come after us?" Ethan leaned against the counter, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. "They already are," he said, his words a stark truth that hung between them like a storm cloud. The tension festered in the days that followed, spilling into their every interaction. Maya grew sharp-edged, her patience frayed, while Ethan withdrew into a brooding silence. One night, As they sat at the dinner table, the air thick with unspoken words, he hesitated before breaking the quiet. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. His voice cautious, weighted. Maya set her fork down, her stomach sinking as she met his gaze. "What is it?" "I have investments in the police department," Ethan admitted, each word measured, as if testing the ground beneath him. "Not directly, but through a fund that supports their operations." Maya's chair scraped loudly as she shoved it back and stood, her breath catching in her throat. "You're joking," she said, her voice rising, sharp with betrayal. "It's not what you think," Ethan said quickly, his hands raised in defense. "It's just business." "Business?" she cut in, her anger a living thing, crackling in the air. "You're funding a corrupt system. Do you realize what you've been enabling?" Ethan's face tightened, his voice straining with desperation. "I didn't know, Maya. I swear I didn't know things were like this. But you benefited from it," she shot back, her eyes blazing, tears of fury stinging at the edges. "While people like me are being brutalized in the streets." He stepped closer, reaching for her arm, but she pulled away, her voice dropping to a cold, cutting edge. "If you're serious about helping me, start by cutting ties with them." Ethan nodded, his expression earnest, almost pleading. "I will," he said. "I'll pull my investments. Just tell me what else I can do." Her glare softened, but only slightly, the wound between them still raw and bleeding. "Don't hold me back when I go after them," she said, her words a challenge, a line drawn. That night, Maya sat alone in their home office, the police badge gleaming under the desk lamp. The crest etched into it gnawed at her, its meaning elusive yet heavy with portent. She dove into research, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she hunted for answers about Harris and his connections. Hours later, she stumbled onto an old article about the Harris Familia dynasty that had poured money into the local police for generations, their influence sprawling like roots through the city's power structure. Her stomach churned as she read of their ties to questionable policies, whispers of corruption trailing their name like shadows. "This isn't just one bad cop," she murmured, her voice trembling with realization. "It's a whole system protecting him." She leaned back, the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. Justice wouldn't come easily. It would mean tearing down the walls shielding Harris, exposing everyone who propped him up. Her anger solidified into something unbreakable, a resolve that burned brighter with every beat of her heart. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others crushed under the same heel, about the lesson that power, when twisted, demanded a reckoning. The next morning, Ethan handed her a stack of files, financial records, property deeds. Reporters faced tense with reluctance. "You're digging into dangerous territory," he warned, his voice low as he watched her spread the papers across the desk. "That's the point," she replied, her eyes scanning the damning evidence. The Harris family didn't just influence the police, they owned it. Their money buying loyalty, promotions, even silence. "They think they're untouchable," she said, her voice steady, fierce. "Someone has to expose them." Ethan's hand hovered near hers, his tone measured but urgent. "You're putting us at risk, Maya. If you keep pushing." She cut him off, her gaze locking with his. "I'm not stopping. Not until they answer for this." The files painted a picture of a system rotten to its core, and with every detail she uncovered, the stakes grew higher. But so did her determination. This was a fight for more than herself. It was a stand against a legacy of abuse, a demand for justice that echoed far beyond one brutal night on a lonely road. The air in the room grew thick with tension as Maya's hand slammed down on the folder, the sharp sound echoing like a judge's gavel. She lifted her gaze to meet Ethan's, her eyes blazing with a fire born of exhaustion and defiance. "They'll come after both of us," she repeated his warning, her voice trembling not with fear but with a simmering fury. "They already came after me, Ethan. Or have you somehow managed to erase the memory of these bruises?" She gestured to her face, where faint shadows of purple still lingered beneath her skin, a cruel reminder of the violence she'd endured. Ethan's expression hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he absorbed her words. "I haven't forgotten," he said, his tone steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "But this isn't just about you anymore, Maya. You're poking at people with deep pockets, powerful friends. Do you really think they'll just sit back and let you tear their world apart?" Maya's response came like a blade cutting through the silence, cold and unyielding. "Let them try." Her words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. A declaration of war against the fear that threatened to choke her. Ethan raked a hand through his dark, tousled hair, frustration spilling over as he struggled to keep his voice even. "This isn't just about fear, Maya, it's about survival. You're not just taking on one person, you're challenging an entire system, alone. Do you honestly think you can win that fight?" Her eyes narrowed, and she snapped back, her voice rising with a mix of hurt and accusation. "I'm not alone here, at least. I didn't think I was. But if you're too afraid to stand by me, Ethan, just say it. Say it now." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. For a moment, it seemed he might speak, might bridge the widening gap between them. But instead, he turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that left Maya reeling. Hours later, the hum of the road beneath her tires was the only sound as Maya drove home from the library, her mind a storm of replayed arguments and unspoken regrets. The dashboard clock glowed a dim 9:47 p.m., casting faint light across her tense features. Her phone buzzed sharply against the passenger's seat, jolting her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, an anonymous text, the words stark and menacing. "You're making a mistake. Drop it while you still can." Her breath caught, fingers hovering over the keypad as she debated a response. Before she could type a single letter, the roar of an engine ripped through the quiet night. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and her heart lurched. A police cruiser loomed behind her, its familiar shape unmistakable even in the dark. Jack Harris. The name flashed through her mind like a warning siren. His lights blazed to life, red and blue slicing through the night, but this was no routine stop. The cruiser surged closer, its bumper nearly kissing hers, headlights flaring in a deliberate attempt to disorient her. Maya's pulse hammered in her ears as she tightened her grip on the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed under her breath, her voice shaking with a mix of terror and outrage. Harris's voice crackled through the loudspeaker, cold and commanding. "Pull over, Dr. Carter. Let's have a little chat." Her stomach twisted, but adrenaline flooded her veins, drowning out the fear. She stomped on the gas, her car lurching forward as she wove through the sparse late-night traffic. Horns blared in her wake, headlights flashing past in a blur. The cruiser stayed on her tail, its siren screaming into the night, a relentless hunter pursuing its prey. Ahead, a narrow alley beckoned a slim chance at escape. Without a second thought, she yanked the wheel hard, tires screeching against asphalt as she veered into the tight space. Harris's larger vehicle faltered, unable to follow, its lights receding as she pressed deeper into the shadows. She didn't stop until she reached a bustling parking lot, the chatter of late-night shoppers a stark contrast to the chaos she'd fled. Her car jolted to a halt, and she slumped against the seat, chest heaving as she fought to steady her breathing. Her trembling hands fumbled for her phone, dialing Ethan with clumsy urgency. "Jack Harris just chased me down," she said when he answered, her voice quaking despite her efforts to sound strong. "What, are you okay?" Ethan's panic crackled through the line, raw and immediate. "I'm fine," she lied, swallowing hard. "But I can't keep doing this alone. I need legal protection." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of Rachel Moore's small, impeccably organized office, illuminating stacks of files and legal pads that spoke of her relentless dedication. Rachel, a no-nonsense attorney with a razor-sharp mind and a reputation for toppling giants, leaned back in her chair, sizing Maya up with a discerning gaze. "You've got one hell of a case here," she said after Maya poured out her story, her voice steady despite the weight of it all. "But this isn't just about one rogue cop. You're up against a system, a damn ugly one. You sure you're ready for that?" Maya met her eyes, unflinching. "I don't care how messy it gets. I need someone who isn't afraid to fight dirty if that's what it takes." Rachel's lips twitched into a faint, approving smile. "All right then. Step 1, we build a fortress of a case. Evidence, witnesses, protection airtight. This won't be fast, and it sure as hell won't be easy. But if you're all in, so am I." Maya didn't hesitate. "I'm in." With Rachel's backing, Maya's resolve deepened. She knew she couldn't topple the Harris familiar, the corrupt machine they wielded alone. She needed allies, voices willing to rise above the fear. Her next meeting brought her face to face with Emma Lane, an investigative journalist whose bylines had exposed scandals that shook cities. Emma was all business, her sharp eyes glinting with curiosity as she leaned forward. Notepad in hand. "I've heard whispers of cases like yours before," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "Cops like Harris don't work solo. If we dig deep enough, we'll find the threads money trails. Shady deals, maybe even more victims. Where do you want to start?" Maya's answer came swift and firm. "Let's show them the whole damn picture." Together, the trio launched into their mission with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Rachel combed through her network, tracking down potential witnesses who might dare to speak. Emma chased leads with the tenacity of a bloodhound, her fingers flying across her keyboard late into the night. Maya, though drained from reliving her own nightmare, threw herself into the work, her anger a fuel that refused to burn out. Over the next few days, they sat with men and women whose lives had been scarred by Harris and his ilk. A middle-aged mechanic, his hands still stained with grease, recounted how Harris had planted drugs in his truck during a routine stop, his voice cracking as he described the months he'd lost to a false charge. A young mother, her eyes hollow with sleepless nights, whispered of the threats that silenced her after she'd dared to file a complaint. Threats delivered, with Harris's smug grin. Each story wove into a tapestry of abuse, a pattern of intimidation and violence buried beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference. Late one night, the glow of a desk lamp cast long shadows across Rachel's office as Maya paced, her voice tight with realization. "This isn't just corruption, it's a machine. Harris is just one piece of it." Rachel nodded, her face grim as she flipped through a stack of notes. "We need hard proof to back these stories, or they're just whispers in the wind." Emma, hunched over her laptop, looked up with a spark of determination. "I've been digging through police records. Too many complaints against Harris Dezensklis without a single follow-up. I'm close to getting the files. We're building something solid here." But the closer they got, the darker the shadows grew. One afternoon, Ethan's voice crackled through Maya's phone, sharp with alarm. "I just found the Carcamione slashed the tires." This wasn't random. Her stomach plummeted, a cold dread settling in her bones. "It's him, isn't it?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Ethan's silence stretched long before he spoke. "You need to watch your back, Maya. He's not stopping at warnings anymore." That night, as she pored over witness statements in the dim light of her living room, a faint noise at the back door snapped her to attention. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and crept down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards amplifying her fear. The sound of retreating footsteps faded before she could confront the intruder. But the broken window latch she found the next morning told its own story. Nothing was taken, but the violation lingered like a ghost. "We can't let this scare us off," she told Ethan later, her voice fierce despite the tremor in her hands. "It just means we're hitting a nerve." Rachel agreed, her tone steely. "This is intimidation. Pure and simple. Back down now, and they've already won." The turning point came when Maya stumbled across a cache of financial records, buried in public fillings, donations, payments, contracts, all tied to the Harris family like a web of puppet strings. She spread the papers across Rachel's desk, her finger jabbing at highlighted lines. "They've been bankrolling the department for decades. Promotions, cover-ups, it's all here. This is how they've kept their grip." Rachel's eyes sharpened as she scanned the documents. "A predator sensing blood. This is dynamite. If we can tie their money to Harris's actions, we've got the whole damn system by the throat." Emma's phone buzzed, and she cursed softly as she read the message. "Harris just filed a harassment complaint against you, Maya. Says you've been stalking him." Maya let out a bitter laugh, the sound raw and jagged. "He's trying to bury me before we can go public." Rachel was already on her feet, laptop in hand. "Let him try. We'll hit back with evidence. Buckle up, this is about to get ugly." That night, the team huddled in Rachel's office, finalizing their plan under the flicker of fluorescent lights. They'd pair the financial records with witness testimonies, a one-two punch to expose the Harris family's chokehold on the department. Maya felt a storm of emotions, dread coiling in her gut, determination burning in her chest. "We're striking first," she said, her voice steady despite the weight pressing down on her. Let's make it count. At dawn, Emma's article hit the web, a blazing torch in the darkness. By midday, the city was ablaze with outrage. The headline screamed, "Officer Jack Harris, a cop shielded by corruption." It laid bare Maya's ordeal, the voices of other victims, and the Harris family's financial stranglehold, each word a call to arms. Maya watched the online frenzy unfold from Rachel's office, social media exploding with hashtags Justicekefery and policy corruption. Within hours, protesters flooded the streets outside police headquarters. Their chants a thunderous demand for accountability. "They're listening," Maya murmured, relief mingling with resolve. Rachel's nod was curt but certain. "Harris won't go down without a fight. Brace yourself." The backlash came swift and brutal. By evening, local news aired a statement from Harris's lawyer, a slick man in a tailored suit who painted Maya as a scheming liar. Harris himself took the screen, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "She's manipulating the system. Those bruises, she provoked that fight. She's been hunting for trouble, and now she's dragging my name through the dirt." Maya's fists clenched as she watched, fury boiling beneath her skin. "He's making me the monster," she spat, pulling away from Ethan's comforting hand. "This isn't just about me, it's about everyone he's crushed. And now he's trying to crush me too." Rachel paced, her mind racing. "We hit back now." Emma flooded them with more evidence. Emma's fingers danced across her laptop, her reply fierce. "Already on it." The pressure mounted, a relentless tide wearing Maya down. Public scrutiny, Harris's smears, the endless fight for justice all pressed against her like a vice. One night, as protests echoed through the streets and into her living room, she sank onto the couch beside Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep this up forever. The harder we push, the heavier it gets." Ethan reached for her, his presence a quiet anchor. But even that couldn't lift the weight. She thought of the mechanic's broken dreams, the mother's haunted eyes, the countless others silenced by fear. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a reckoning, a brutal lesson in the cost of power unchecked. And as the city burned with their cause, Maya knew there was no turning back. The machine could roar and rage, but she'd fight until it broke her. Ethan leaned closer, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that seemed to anchor the room. "You're not facing this alone, Maya. I'm right here with Yorishal and Emma too. The people out there, they're waking up, standing with you. Don't let him crush your spirit." That's how he wins. His words hung in the air, firm and unyielding. Yet the space between them crackled with unspoken strain. Maya's chest tightened, a storm of emotions swirling within her. She was grateful, deeply so, for Ethan's unwavering loyalty, his refusal to back down. But beneath that gratitude simmered a quiet resentment, sharp and bitter. His connection to the police, however distant, had tangled their fight in ways that gnawed at her. It wasn't his fault, not really, but it made every step feel heavier, every battle steeper. 2 days later, the air shifted. Rachel sat at her cluttered desk, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs and empty coffee cups, when a small, unmarked package landed in her hands. It had come without a sender's name, slipped through the chaos of her office like a whisper in a storm. A USB drive gleamed dully inside, paired with a scrap of paper bearing a single, scrawled line, "The truth always finds a way." Her pulse quickened as she plugged it in, the screen flickering to life with grainy footage that stole her breath. There, in the dim light of a police precinct, stood Officer Jack Harris, his broad frame looming as he faced 2 men in crisp suits, ranking officials, their faces taut with unease. The audio crackled but carried every damning word. "We can't let this spiral," one official muttered, his voice low and urgent. "If Maya Carter keeps pushing, it'll drag the whole damn system into the light." Harris smirked, his tone thick with contempt. "She's just another loudmouth with a chip on her shoulder. I'll deal with her some as the others." The second official leaned in, his eyes cold. "Make sure there's nothing left to trace back to us." The video cut to black, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Maya sat frozen as the footage played out, her hands trembling in her lap. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the reality settled over her like a shroud. "This is it," she said at last, her voice cutting through the quiet with a steadiness that surprised even her. "This isn't just one crooked cop. It's a web of corrupt network shielding him. Rachel's eyes blazed with a fierce resolve, her mind already racing ahead. We've got to get this out there into the courtroom, the media, everywhere. This could tear their whole operation apart. Across the room, Emma's fingers flew over her laptop, her brow furrowed in concentration. If we drop this now, she said, her voice tight with urgency, they'll have no choice but to react. They can't bury it anymore. Maya met her gaze, a fire igniting in her chest. Do it, she said, her tone unyielding. They wanted a war. Let's give them one they can't win. Armed with the video, Maya and her team poured everything into building their case, knowing it would be the linchpin of their fight. The courtroom loomed ahead, a battlefield buzzing with anticipation. When the day arrived, the air was thick with tension, a restless hum rippling through the crowd. Supporters lined the benches, their faces etched with hope, while skeptics whispered doubts from the shadows. Maya stepped onto the stand, her shoulders squared. Her bruises faded, but the scars of that night carved deep into her resolve. Rachel stood beside her, a pillar of calm amid the storm, her voice clear as she addressed the jury. Dr. Maya Carter is here to tell you what happened the night Officer Jack Harris attacked her. Her story isn't just about one man's cruelty, it's about a system rotting from the inside. Propping him up, Maya's fingers gripped the wooden edges of the stand, her breath steadying as she began. I was driving home after a 16-hour shift at the hospital. It was late, the streets quiet, when I saw the flashing lights in my rearview. Officer Harris pulled me over. At first, I thought it was routine a taillight out, maybe a speeding ticket, but he didn't care about my driving. He zeroed in on my tattoos, the ones on my forearm, symbols of my heritage, my family's story. He called them gang signs, accused me of being a criminal with no evidence, no reason. Her voice held firm, even as the memory clawed at her. I stayed calm, kept my hands visible, followed every rule. But he didn't want compliance. He wanted control. He yanked me out of the car, slammed me against the hood so hard I felt the metal buckle under me. Then his fist came down right across my face. I didn't fight back. I didn't even raise my voice. He hit me because he knew no one would stop him. The room stirred, a wave of murmurs rolling through the spectators. Rachel stepped forward, her movements deliberate as she gestured to the courtroom's towering screen. Let the jury see the truth for themselves. The video flickered on, Harris's sneering face filling the frame. His voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with arrogance. She's just another loudmouth. I'll handle her some as the others. The officials' orders followed, their words a chilling echo, nothing left to trace back to us. The jury's expressions hardened, some leaning forward, others exchanging glances of disbelief. Whispers erupted among the crowd, a mix of outrage and shock rippling outward. Rachel returned to her seat, her composure unshaken, while Harris's defense attorney, Philip Conrad, rose with a predator's grace. Conrad approached the stand, his sharp features softened by a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Dr. Carter, he began, his tone syrupy with mock politeness. You claim this attack was unprovoked. But isn't it true your tattoos have sparked confusion before? Maybe a misunderstanding first, even a confrontation or two in your past. Maya's gaze narrowed, her jaw tightening. My tattoos are cultural, personal. They don't give anyone the right to hurt me. Conrad's smirk widened, a glint of triumph in his eyes. And yet, isn't it possible Officer Harris felt threatened? Could he have seen those symbols and thought reasonably? Or not that you were tied to something dangerous, prompting a stronger response? Maya's voice cut through his insinuation like a blade. His response was brutality. He didn't misread Meh abused his power because he wanted to. Conrad leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And this video convenient, it shows up just as your story hits the headlines. Tell me, Dr. Carter, how much of this is a performance for the cameras? Rachel shot to her feet, her voice ringing out. Objection, bossless accusations. The judge's gavel cracked against the bench. Sustained, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Conrad stepped back, casting Maya a final, lingering look. No further questions, Your Honor. But the damage lingered, a seed of doubt planted in the air. The break that followed did little to ease the strain. Outside, the courthouse steps had become a war zone. A sea of Maya's supporters waved signs justice for Maya, their voices rising in a defiant chant. But across the street, a smaller knot of Harris's defenders stood their ground, their shouts bitter and accusing. "She's tearing down a good cop," one yelled, his face red with fury. The tension snapped like a taut wire, and within moments, fists flew. A burly man in a support the blue shirt lunged at a protester clutching a sign with Maya's name. The wood splintering as they crashed together. Officers swarmed in, barking orders, but the chaos spiraled, a raw, ugly clash of loyalties. Inside, Maya pressed her palms against the courtroom window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched, her face draining of color. "This is what they want," she murmured, her voice hollow. A circus to drown out the truth. Rachel's hand rested on her shoulder, her expression grim. "And a scare tactic, don't let it get to you." Back in the courtroom, the fight pressed on. Rachel called witness after witness, each one peeling back another layer of Harris's history, complaints buried, reports rewritten, victims silenced. A retired dispatcher, her hands trembling but her voice steady, recounted late-night calls from Harris's precinct that never made it to official logs. A young beat cop, barely 25, shifted nervously as he admitted to seeing Harris rough up suspects, with no repercussions. The pattern was undeniable, a tapestry of abuse woven tight by a system that shielded its own. But just as the tide seemed to turn, a blow landed that shook them to their core. Maya stepped into Rachel's office after a grueling day in court. Her shoulders slumped from exhaustion. Emma paced the room, her phone clutched tight, her face pale as moonlight. "What's wrong?" Maya demanded, her stomach twisting at the sight of Emma's stricken expression. Emma hesitated, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Marcus Holton of our witness is dead. They found him this afternoon." Maya's heart plummeted, a cold void opening in her chest. Marcus had been a former officer, a weary man with haunted eyes who'd risked everything to testify about Harris's intimidation tactics. His words had carried weight, a promise of cracks in the precinct's armor. "How?" Rachel asked, her voice sharp as a blade. Emma swallowed hard. "Shot. The police are saying it's a robbery gone wrong," but she trailed off, the unspoken hanging heavy between them. "It's a convenient," Maya finished, her fists clenching until her knuckles whitened. "They killed him to shut him up and to scare us." Rachel's face darkened, a storm brewing behind her steady gaze. "If they're willing to murder Marcus, they won't stop there. We need to move fast." Maya nodded, her fear hardening into something fiercer. "Then we fight harder for Marcus, for everyone they've crushed." The office fell silent, save for the faint hum of Rachel's laptop, the weight of their resolve settling over them like armor. Marcus's death wasn't just a loss, it was a warning, a stark lesson in the cost of challenging power. But it also lit a fire in Maya, a blazing certainty that justice, however elusive, was worth the fight. That night, as Maya drove home through the city's shadowed streets, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Her gut churned, but she answered, steeling herself. Maya Carter, a voice sneered, familiar and venomous. "Harris." Her blood turned to ice. "Smart girl." He drawled, "I told you to back off. Now look what's happening. People around you are dropping like flies." Her grip tightened on the wheel, her voice trembling with rage. "You're a coward, Harris. Killing Marcus won't bury the truth." A low, dark laugh crackled through the line. "We'll see about that. Drive safe tonight, Dr. Carter." The call cut off, leaving a hollow dread in its wake. She glanced into her rearview mirror, catching the glint of headlights trailing too close. Her pulse spiked, her breath catching as the car behind her surged forward, its bumper grazing hers with a sickening scrape. Maya floored the gas, her tires squealing as she wove through traffic, the city blurring past in streaks of light. The pursuing car matched her every move, relentless, its engine roaring like a predator on the hunt. She veered onto a side street, the narrow road lined with flickering streetlights, praying she could lose them, but the headlights stayed locked on her, unyielding. Panic surged, then sharpened into adrenaline as the car rammed her again, jolting her forward. "Damn it," she hissed, her hands slick with sweat on the wheel. The stakes had never been clearer. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone the system had broken and the price of fighting back. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles turned white. her palms slick with sweat as her eyes darted toward the faint outline of an exit ramp ahead. It veered off into an industrial sprawl, a maze of shadowed streets and skeletal buildings that loomed like silent sentinels. Under the night sky, there was no time to weigh her options, no room for hesitation, only the raw instinct to survive. She yanked the wheel hard, her car lurching as the tires shrieked against the asphalt, a high-pitched wail that pierced the stillness. Behind her, the menacing glow of headlights flared brighter in her rearview mirror. The car tailing her didn't falter, it accelerated, closing the gap as she plunged into the desolate industrial zone. Maya's mind was a storm of panic and focus, thoughts colliding like shards of broken glass. The streets here were a graveyard of half-finished dreams, rows of concrete shells, their gaping windows dark and hollow, flanked by towering stacks of construction materials shrouded in dust and neglect. The only light came from her own headlights slicing through the blackness, and the relentless beams of her pursuer, casting jagged shadows that danced across the abandoned landscape. Her breath hitched as the car behind her surged forward, its engine roaring with predatory intent, trying to hem her in against a row of rusted scaffolding. She swerved at the last second, her fender grazing a pile of metal pipes. The impact sent them tumbling with a deafening clatter, a chaotic symphony of steel crashing onto the road and forcing the chasing car to veer wildly. To avoid the debris, her ears still rang with Harris's voice from earlier that night, smooth and laced with a veiled threat. "Drive safe tonight." The words gnawed at her now, a bitter reminder of how far his reach extended. Her eyes flicked ahead, scanning the bleak terrain until they landed on an open construction site, its gates yawning wide like an invitation or a trap. A desperate plan flickered to life in her mind, reckless and razor-thin, but it was all she had. She slammed her foot on the gas, the engine roaring as she barreled toward the site. The car behind her hesitated for a heartbeat long enough for her to notice before it tore after her, tires kicking up clouds of gritty dust that swirled in the dim glow of her taillights. Inside the site, Maya navigated a labyrinth of towering machinery and scattered debris, her heart hammering so fiercely she could feel it in her throat. The air was thick with the smell of oil and concrete dust, the ground uneven beneath her tires as she wove through the chaos. Then she saw it, a narrow slit between two massive stacks of concrete barriers, barely wide enough for her sedan. It was a gamble that could end in disaster. But stopping wasn't an option. She floored the accelerator, her jaw clenched as she aimed for the gap. The screech of metal against concrete was excruciating, a bone-rattling grind that jolted her entire body as her car scraped through. Behind her, the pursuing vehicle wasn't as fortunate. It clipped the edge of a barrier, spinning wildly out of control before slamming into a heap of steel beams with a thunderous crash that reverberated through the empty site. The sound was a brutal punctuation to her escape, but Maya didn't dare glance back. She kept driving, hands trembling uncontrollably as she steered back toward the main road, the adrenaline surging through her veins like wildfire. When she finally pulled into her driveway, the silence was suffocating. She cut the engine and sat there, motionless, her body quaking as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Her phone buzzed sharply against the passenger seat, jolting her from her daze. She flinched, her nerves still raw, but relief washed over her when she saw Ethan's name glowing on the screen. "Are you okay?" His voice was taut, strained with a worry he couldn't hide. "They tried to run me off the road," she managed, her own voice shaky, fragile in a way she hated. "Harris and his thugs." Ethan let out a muffled curse, his anger palpable even through the phone. "We're getting security. No arguments this time." For once, Maya didn't resist. The fight in her was still there, but it was bruised, battered by the night's ordeal. Later, as she sat with Rachel and Emma in the dim light of her living room, the weight of their situation pressed down on her like a physical force. The air was heavy with unspoken fears, the flicker of a single lamp casting long shadows across their faces. "This isn't just about justice anymore," Maya said, her voice low but resolute, each word carved from the exhaustion she felt. "It's survival. We need to lock down security. Bring in more people Harris can't touch." Rachel, her dark eyes steady despite the tension etching lines into her brow, nodded slowly. "We'll reinforce everything we've got. But Maya, you can't keep carrying this alone." We'll find allies, ones he can't scare off. Emma, quieter but no less determined, leaned forward. Her hands clasped tightly. We're stronger together. Harris underestimates that. Maya met Rachel's gaze, a spark of defiance flaring in her chest. Good, because I'm not stopping until this ends. At midnight, her phone vibrated again, the sharp sound cutting through the stillness like a blade. A single message glowed on the screen. If you want the truth, meet me at the old warehouse on Harbor Street. Come alone. Ethan, standing behind her, read it over her shoulder, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out in sharp relief. This stinks of a setup, he muttered, his voice rough with suspicion. Rachel, seated across the table, frowned deeply, her fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the wood. They're trying to isolate you, make you an easy target. We can't let them, Emma piped up, her voice softer but firm. If we ignore it, we might miss something big. But we're not sending Maya in alone. I'll go till we can record it all. Despite the gnawing unease in their guts, they agreed to turn the meeting to their advantage. Ethan insisted on joining, his protective streak overriding any objections, while Rachel equipped them with tiny recording devices sewn into their clothes. Her hands steadied despite the stakes. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking relic of rust and decay swallowed by the night. The air inside was thick with the stench of mildew and old metal, the faint glow of distant streetlights seeping through cracked windows to paint eerie shadows across the walls. Maya's pulse thudded in her ears as they stepped inside, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space like a warning. I don't like this, Ethan whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness. Every nerve in his body coiled tight. Then came the slam of a door, a sharp, jarring bang that shattered the silence. Jack Harris emerged from the shadows, his silhouette flanked by two hulking figures whose presence alone radiated menace. He held a pistol loosely in one hand, his grin a twisted slash of white in the gloom. Well, Dr. Carter, he drawled, his voice oily with contempt. You just don't know when to give up, do you? Maya squared her shoulders, forcing her voice to hold steady even as fear clawed at her insides. You're the one who's scared, Harris. That's why you hide behind guns and threats. His grin vanished, his eyes narrowing into slits of cold fury. Scared? No, I'm just tidying up a mess. Drop this case or you're done. He raised the gun, the barrel glinting faintly as it pointed at her chest. Ethan stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between her and the threat. Back off, he growled, his voice a low rumble of defiance. Harris sneered, unimpressed. This isn't some Hollywood flick, hero. Good guys don't win here. Rachel moved then, her hands raised in a gesture of calm, but her eyes blazing with resolve. Think hard, Harris. This is all being recorded. Pull that trigger, and you're finished. One of Harris's men lunged forward, seizing Rachel's arm with a grip meant to bruise, but before he could shove her back, Ethan charged. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Ethan tackled Harris, the gun flying from his hand and skittering across the concrete with a metallic clatter. One thug threw a wild punch, but Ethan ducked and drove a fist into the man's jaw, the crack of bone against bone ringing out. Maya dove for the gun, only to be caught by the second thug, his meaty hand twisting her arm until pain flared white-hot up her shoulder. She bit back a cry, stomping hard on his foot. His grip slackened just enough for her to wrench free. Get the gun, Rachel shouted, her voice cutting through the fray. Emma, clutching her camera with trembling hands, darted closer, filming every second of the madness. Harris shoved Ethan off and scrambled for the weapon, but Maya kicked it away at the last moment, sending it spinning into the shadows. Enough, Harris roared, blood trickling from his split lip as he lunged at Ethan again. Their struggle was a brutal dance of fists and fury, the air thick with grunts and the thud of flesh against flesh. Then, a new voice sliced through the chaos. Stop. Everyone froze. From the darkness stepped a young man in a crisp police uniform, his hands raised in a plea for peace. I'm James Parker, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his stance. I'm here to talk, not fight. Harris's face twisted with rage. You little traitor. James ignored him, turning to Maya with a look of quiet resolve. I've been watching this play out. I know what Harris and his cronies have done bank records, emails, everything you need to bury them. Harris spat, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. You're lying. Leave now, or you're dead. James straightened, unflinching. I was done the moment I saw what you did to Herto everyone. I couldn't stay silent. He handed Rachel a flash drive, his fingers brushing hers briefly. Take it and go. What about you? Maya asked, urgency sharpening her words. James hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the shadows. I'll hold them off. Get this to the authorities before they bury it. The distant wail of sirens pierced the night, sending a jolt of urgency through them all. Rachel grabbed Maya's arm. We have to move, Eno. Harris cursed, his voice a snarl of frustration as Ethan, Rachel, and Emma bolted for the exit. They piled into Maya's car, adrenaline fueling their escape as the sirens grew louder, a promise of reckoning in the air. In the rearview mirror, Maya caught a fleeting glimpse of Harris and his men retreating, their scheme unraveling like thread pulled from a seam. At a safe house miles away, Emma plugged the flash drive into her laptop, her fingers trembling as the screen filled with damning files records of bribes, incriminating messages, proof that tied Harris to corruption at the highest levels. This is it, Rachel said, her voice steady but alive with urgency. This blows it all wide open. Maya exhaled, her hands still shaking, but her resolve hardening. We've got what we need. Now we make sure the world sees it. With James's evidence and his courage bolstering their fight, they prepared to take it to court, knowing the danger would escalate, but the truth was finally within reach. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension as Harris's team unveiled their ace, Brian Collins, a weary man with a smug grin, claiming to be Maya's former associate. He took the stand with an air of rehearsed confidence, his voice smooth and calculated. Maya Carter and her husband Ethan cooked up this whole story, he declared, leaning back as if savoring the gasps rippling through the room. They're smearing the police for their own gain. They even paid me cash to fake evidence. Murmurs of shock and confusion buzzed through the crowd. Maya's jaw tightened, her fists clenching beneath the table until her nails bit into her palms. Rachel shot to her feet, her voice slicing through the noise. Your Honor, we demand immediate cross-examination. This testimony is baseless nonsense. The judge's stern nod was all she needed. Proceed. Rachel approached Brian like a predator sizing up prey, her gaze unrelenting. Mr. Collins, you say Maya paid you to fabricate evidence. Where's the proof? Receipts, bank records, anything? Brian's smirk flickered, but he recovered quickly. All cash. She's too smart for paper trails. Rachel didn't blink. No documentation, no witnesses to these so-called meetings. Convenient. Isn't it true you were fired from your last job for cooking the books? His composure cracked, a flush creeping up his neck as the courtroom held its breath. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just a prize to be won, it was a battlefield, where the powerful fell hardest when their abuses came to light. Harris's empire of threats and corruption crumbled under the weight of truth, a stark reminder that wielding power without accountability was a house of cards, waiting for the wind. For Maya, every near miss and every ally gained deepened her understanding that the fight wasn't hers alone. It was a collective stand against a system rotten at its core. And as the evidence mounted, so did the certainty that consequences, when ignored, only grew sharper in their inevitable strike. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy, a simmering cauldron of anticipation, as Rachel's voice sliced through the thick air, like a sharpened blade. This has nothing to do with distraction, she snapped, her eyes blazing with righteous fire as she glared at Brian, whose fingers twitched nervously against the armrest of the witness stand. You're a known liar, dragged in here to muddy the waters and pull focus from the mountain of evidence. Stacking up against Jack Harris, her words landed like a thunderclap, and the jury's gazes flickered back and forth, some wide with shock, others narrowed in suspicion. But when Rachel's commanding presence and Brian, who seemed to shrink under the relentless barrage of her questions, sweat beaded on his forehead, his breath shallow, as if the weight of her scrutiny pinned him like a trapped animal. At the defense table, Jack Harris sat rigid, his scowl deepening into a mask of barely contained rage. His broad shoulders hunched slightly, betraying the cracks forming in his carefully constructed facade. He'd spent weeks orchestrating a campaign to tear down Maya Carter, the woman who dared to challenge his authority. But now that plan was unraveling like a frayed rope. His dark eyes darted toward the jury, searching for any sign of doubt he could cling to. But all he found were faces hardened by the mounting revelations. The air around him crackled with tension, his fingers curling into fists beneath the table as he fought to suppress the storm brewing inside. When the judge called for a recess, the courtroom emptied into a chaos of murmurs and footsteps. But for Maya and her team, there was no reprieve. Stepping outside, they were met not with fresh air, but with a digital onslaught headliness screaming across the internet, each one more vicious than the last. Dr. Carter's vendetta against law enforcement blared one article, while another branded her Heracop's nemesis. Radical activist targets police. The words twisted her life into a grotesque caricature, painting her as a fame-hungry opportunist clawing her way up by exploiting a broken system. Her chest tightened as she scrolled through the venomous posts on social media. Supporters rallied with quiet resolve, but the critics roared louder, their voices a deafening chorus demanding she abandon her fight. Each accusation felt like a needle piercing her resolve. Yet beneath the hurt simmered a growing fury she couldn't ignore. Back at the hospital, the smear campaign's poison seeped into the sterile halls where Maya had once found purpose. Colleagues who'd stood by her side through grueling night shifts now cast sidelong glances, their whispers trailing her like shadows. In the break room, the tension boiled over when Dr. Reynolds, a senior surgeon with graying hair and a perpetually stern jaw, cornered her near the coffee machine. His voice cut through the hum of the fluorescent lights, sharp and accusing. "Maya, I'm hearing ugly things. People say you're using this case to carve out a name for yourself." His arms crossed tightly over his chest, his posture radiating judgment. Maya's hands trembled as she set down her mug, her patience fraying like a worn thread. "What people are saying is built on lies, and you know it," she shot back, her voice low but edged with steel. "Or are you too comfortable in your bubble to see the truth?" Reynolds' lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing as he replied, "All I see is this hospital drowning in scrutiny because of you. Patients are asking questions. Maya, maybe you should have kept this crusade out of the spotlight." Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of frustration and betrayal. "That's exactly what they want," she hissed, stepping closer, her gaze locking with his. "They want me to slink away, to stop fighting. If you can't see that, you're blind or worse. Complicit." The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Reynolds blinked, momentarily thrown, but before he could respond, Maya turned on her heel and stormed out, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Inside, her emotions churned danger at the betrayal, fear of losing her allies, and a flicker of doubt she refused to let take root. That night, peace shattered like glass when the shrill wail of the fire alarm ripped Maya and Ethan from sleep. Smoke curled under their bedroom door, a sinister intruder carrying the acrid scent of burning wood. Maya's heart lurched as she stumbled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. "Get up," Ethan's voice boomed, raw with urgency, as he yanked her arm and pulled her toward safety. The hallway was a suffocating haze, the smoke stinging their eyes and clawing at their throats. Ethan fumbled for the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, his hands shaking as he wrestled with the pin, while Maya raced to the security panel. Her fingers flew over the controls, pulling up the camera feed. And what she saw turned her blood to ice. 3 shadowy figures, masked and fleeting, darted into the night, leaving behind a trail of gasoline cans glinting under the moonlight. "This was no accident," Maya whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of terror and realization. "They meant to kill us." Ethan grabbed her arm, his face pale but resolute. "Let's go now," he shouted, dragging her toward the exit as flames roared to life behind them. The living room was a hellscape, fire racing up the curtains and licking hungrily at the walls. Heat seared their skin as they stumbled through the chaos, coughing and clinging to each other until they burst into the cool night air. Outside, neighbors clustered on the lawn, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow, pointing and shouting as sirens wailed in the distance. Maya stood frozen, watching her Homer sanctuary devoured by the blaze. Fear coiled in her gut, but it was quickly overtaken by a molten fury. "This is Harris," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "He's trying to break us." Ethan's arm tightened around her. His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscles twitch. "He won't," he said, his tone a vow. "We're not stopping." By morning, the ashes of their home still smoldered, but Maya's resolve burned brighter. Sitting in Rachel's cluttered office, surrounded by legal pads and coffee cups, she made a choice. "They want us scared, cornered, alone," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etching lines into her face. "We can't let them control the story. Let's take it publish everything. The evidence, the threats, the fire. If they're playing dirty, we'll shout the truth from the rooftops." Emma Lane, a weary journalist with a sharp mind and sharper pen, nodded eagerly, her eyes glinting with purpose. "A press conference," she suggested, tapping her notebook. "We lay it all out. It's a gamble, but it could shift the tide." Rachel leaned forward, her expression calculating. "We'll need to be smart about it. Lead with the hard evidence. Tie Harris to his web of corruption. Not just your story. Make it undeniable." By dusk, they'd pulled it off. The room buzzed with reporters, their cameras trained on Maya as she stood at the podium, flanked by Rachel, Ethan, and Emma. Her hands gripped the edges of the stand, but her voice rang out clear and unshaken. "For months, I've battled a system built to crush people like me. Jack Harris isn't just one rotten cough's a symptom of a sickness rotting this city from the inside." She laid out the proof, a flash drive from James Parker, a nervous whistleblower who'd risked everything, grainy video of Harris snarling threats in a dimly lit warehouse, and financial records linking him to high-ranking officials who'd turned a blind eye. Gasps rippled through the crowd with each revelation, followed by the frantic clatter of keyboards. "Last night," she continued, her voice rising, "they set my home ablaze. Tried to murder me and my family. But I'm still here, and I'm not shutting up." The room exploded in applause, a wave of support that washed over her like a lifeline. The city trembled in the aftermath. Protests swelled, voices rising in unison to demand Harris's suspension and a full investigation. His defense team flailed, doubling down on their lies, but the evidence was a tidal wave they couldn't outrun. For Maya, the fight was far from over, but as she prepared for the trial's next chapter, a fierce determination took root. Justice wasn't just a distant hope, it was a fire she'd stoke until it consumed the corruption that had festered too long. Days later, the courtroom was a pressure cooker, packed with spectators craning their necks, journalists scribbling furiously, and activists clutching signs that read truth over power. Maya sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight despite the exhaustion weighing on her bones, while Harris glowered from the defense side, his defiance a dark cloud rolling across the room. Rachel rose, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she called Harris to the stand. He strode forward with deliberate steps, his uniform crisp, his smirk a taunt. Raising his hand to swear the oath, his eyes locked on Maya's, a silent promise of retribution. "Officer Harris," Rachel began, her voice calm but laced with steel, "you're accused of assault, corruption, and intimidation. Let's start with the video you, threatening Dr. Carter with a loaded gun. Care to explain?" Harris tilted his head, his lips curling. "That video's a lie. I was warning Hirsch's been stirring up trouble, slandering good cops." The gun, self-defense. His casual arrogance hung in the air, but Rachel didn't flinch. "So, pointing a firearm at an unarmed woman is your idea of a warning?" she pressed, stepping closer. Harris shifted, his smirk faltering. She was out of line. People like her don't respect order. Someone had to show her. The jury stiffened, a murmur rustling through the crowd. "People like her," Rachel echoed, her tone a scalpel. "What do you mean by that, officer?" Harris froze, his tongue caught in the trap of his own words. "People who think they're above the law," he muttered, but the damage was done. Rachel seized the moment. "Yet the evidence says you're the one breaking the law. Let's talk money. Over $100,000 funneled to your account from shell companies tied to your brother. Explain that." Harris's face darkened, his voice rising. "That's none of your damn business." The judge's gavel crashed down. "Sit, Officer Harris, or you're out of here." He sank back, seething, his mask of control shattered. In the recess that followed, Maya's team huddled in a small room, the air thick with tension and hope. Ethan squeezed her hand, his voice soft but firm. "You're doing it, Maya." "He's crumbling." Rachel nodded, though her eyes were wary. "He's unraveling. But they'll get desperate. Watch for it." Her words proved prophetic when the defense unveiled Daniel Briggs, a sleazy private investigator with a grin that made Maya's skin crawl. "Doctor, Carter hired me to fake evidence," he drawled, glancing at the jury with feigned sincerity. She wanted Harris gone, no matter the cost. The lie hung in the air, a final gambit from a sinking ship. But Maya's heart pounded with the weight of the fight still ahead. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. Harris's arrogance, built on years of unchecked power, had blinded him to the consequences of his actions. Justice, Maya realized, wasn't a gift handed down. It was a battle won through courage and truth. A lesson etched in every scar this fight had left on her soul. Maya's chest tightened as though the air itself had turned against her, her breath hitching painfully in her throat. She leaned closer to Rachel, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with disbelief. "This is a lie," she murmured, her words carrying the weight of months spent battling shadows that seemed to grow darker with every step. Rachel, poised and unyielding, rose from her seat with a quiet determination that belied the storm brewing in her mind. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished courtroom floor as she approached Mr. Briggs, the man whose smug demeanor had grated on Maya's nerves from the moment he took the stand. "You claim Dr. Carter hired you," Rachel began, her tone measured but edged with a challenge. "Do you have anything at all to back that up? Emails, text messages, receipts?" Her eyes locked onto his, searching for the flicker of doubt she knew was buried beneath his bravado. Briggs shrugged, his shoulders rolling with a casualness that felt rehearsed, almost performative. "She paid me in cash," he said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Pretty clever, huh?" The confidence in his voice was a thin veneer, and Rachel could sense it cracking already. She tilted her head slightly, her expression one of feigned curiosity, though her mind was racing, piecing together the threads of his story to unravel it. "Cash, you say," she mused, pausing for effect. "Then how do you account for these bank records?" She produced a crisp sheet of paper, holding it aloft like a weapon. "They show a $50,000 payment deposited into your account, traced directly to the Harris family. Was that cash too, Mr. Briggs?" The smirk on his face faltered, his eyes darting to the document as though it might burn him. "To don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice losing its earlier swagger, his fingers twitching nervously at his sides. Rachel pressed forward, relentless, her voice rising with a quiet fury as she waved the damning evidence. "This transfer happened 2 weeks ago," she said, her words cutting through the tense silence of the courtroom, "right after you agreed to testify. Quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Briggs opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat, his confidence crumbling like dry earth under Rachel's unyielding scrutiny. She turned sharply to face the jury, her posture commanding their attention. "This man," she declared, gesturing toward Briggs with a sweep of her hand, "a known liar, expects you to believe he received nothing from the Harris family," while pointing the finger at Dr. Carter for fabricating evidence. "Ask yourself, Esho, do you trust?" The jury's eyes followed her every move, their expressions shifting from skepticism to dawning realization. Briggs sat there, diminished, his credibility shattered into fragments, while Maya felt a flicker of hope ignite within her, a fragile flame, but one that grew stronger as the trial edged toward its end. Yet Jack Harris, the architect of this tangled web, wasn't ready to surrender. As the courtroom emptied for a recess, he cornered Maya in the dimly lit hallway, his face contorted with a rage that seemed to pulse beneath his skin. His breath was hot and ragged as he leaned in close, his voice a venomous hiss. "You think you've won, don't you? This isn't over. You'll wish you'd never crossed me." His eyes burned with a manic intensity, and for a moment, Maya felt the old fear clawing at her inside, as fear that had kept her silent for too long. But she squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening like steel. "You've already lost," she replied, her voice icy and steady, cutting through his bluster. "You just haven't realized it yet." Court officers rushed forward, their boots thudding against the tile as they pulled Harris back. his threats lingering in the air like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. The defense made their final, desperate play on the last day of the trial. With a flourish, they unveiled an email allegedly from Maya to a colleague named Emma directing her to tamper with security footage from a warehouse. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers, a wave of tension rippling through the spectators as the grainy text flashed across the screen. Maya's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as a surge of anger and betrayal coursed through her. "It's fake," she whispered fiercely to Rachel, her voice trembling not with fear but with indignation. Rachel rose swiftly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Your Honor," she called, her tone firm and authoritative. "We request an immediate forensic analysis of this email. It's an obvious fabrication." The judge, a stern figure with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded curtly. "Granted," he said, adjourning the trial as the email was whisked away for scrutiny. Hours later, the forensic expert returned, a weary man with glasses perched low on his nose, his expression grave but triumphant. "This email is fraudulent," he announced, his voice carrying across the room. "The metadata shows it was created on a device registered to Officer Jack Harris." The courtroom erupted, gasps and murmurs swelling into a cacophony. Harris's face flushed a deep crimson, his jaw tightening as his lawyer slumped beside him, defeated. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, each passing minute stretching Maya's nerves to their limit. When they finally returned, the four-persona middle-aged woman with a steady gaze stood tall. "In the matter of Jack Harris," she said, her voice unwavering, "we find the defendant guilty on all charges." Cheers exploded from Maya's supporters, a wave of relief crashing over her as tears stung her eyes. Months of sleepless nights, of fighting against a tide of corruption, had finally borne fruit. But Harris wasn't done. As officers moved to cuff him, he lunged at Maya with a wild, guttural shout, his face a mask of unhinged fury. Ethan, ever her steadfast protector, stepped in front of her, his broad frame a shield against the chaos. His muscles tensed, ready to absorb whatever blow might come. But the court officers were faster, wrestling Harris to the ground. "You'll regret this," he screamed, his voice echoing off the walls as they dragged him away, his shoes scraping against the floor. Maya met his glare with unflinching resolve. "Not as much as you will," she said, her words a quiet promise. The victory should have felt like a triumph, a moment to breathe and celebrate. But the shadow of Harris's threats loomed large. That evening, as Maya, Ethan, Rachel, and Emma huddled in a private conference room to decompress, the courthouse shuddered with a sudden, deafening crash. Shouts pierced the air, and panic spread like wildfire through the marble halls. A bailiff burst in, his face pale and slick with sweat, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Harris's men are here," he stammered. "They've barricaded the exits and are demanding access to the evidence room." Maya's heart pounded against her ribcage, a frantic rhythm that drowned out everything else. "The evidence," she said, her voice tight with dread. "They're going to destroy it all." Ethan was already at the door, his jaw set with determination. "We need to get you out of Haranow." But before they could move, the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. A fire alarm shrieked to life, its wail slicing through the tension, and tendrils of smoke began to curl under the door. A deliberate distraction, Maya realized, her mind racing. Rachel grabbed her arm, her grip firm and urgent. "Stay close. We can't let them get to you or the evidence." They crept into the corridor, the air thick with haze, their footsteps muffled by the growing chaos. Armed men loomed ahead, blocking their path to the nearest exit. One of them, a hulking figure with a scar slicing across his cheek, sneered at them. "Thought this was over, did you? Harris sends his regards." Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched, his voice a low growl. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me." The man's smirk widened, a glint of sadistic pleasure in his eyes. Without warning, Ethan lunged, his fist connecting with the man's hand and sending a gun clattering to the floor. The two crashed into a nearby desk, papers flying like startled birds, a lamp toppling with a shattering crash. Two more assailants charged, their boots pounding against the tile, but Ethan was relentless. He seized a chair, swinging it with deadly precision to fell one attacker, then grappled with the other in a flurry of fists and grunts. "Run, Maya," he shouted, landing a wild punch that bought her a fleeting second. But she froze, her heart screaming against leaving him. Rachel and Emma yanked her back as the fight raged, Ethan finally subduing the last man with a bone-crunching blow. Blood streaked his face, but his eyes blazed with resolve. "Let's go," he urged, breathless. The group pressed toward the evidence room, the chaos around them an orchestrated symphony of Harris's desperation. Maya's mind churned. If the evidence was lost, her fight would be for nothing, her sacrifices reduced to ash. "We can't let them destroy the files," she said, her voice ringing with unshakable determination. Rachel nodded, her face set. "We'll hold them off. Go secure the evidence." Clutching Emma's hand, Maya sprinted down the smoke-choked hallway, the distant crack of gunshots reverberating through the walls. They reached the evidence room, where a young security officer stood, his baton trembling in his grip. "We're here for the Harris case files," Maya said, her tone urgent but steady. "They can't be lost." A loud bang rattled the building, and the officer jolted into action. "Follow me," he said, leading them into a secured chamber lined with boxes and humming digital drives. Maya rifled through the stacks, her hands shaking as she gathered the critical documents of painstaking work, condensed into fragile sheets and drives. Emma, quick and efficient, plugged a portable hard drive into the system, her fingers flying across the keys to back up the digital copies. The door burst open with a splintering crack, and another of Harris's men stormed in, a crowbar gleaming in his hand. "Hand it over," he barked, his voice rough with menace. Emma stepped forward, clutching the hard drive, her eyes blazing. "Over my dead body." He lunged, but Maya ducked low, grabbing a heavy binder and swinging it with all her might into his ribs. Emma followed with a sharp kick to his shin, and he crumpled with a groan. Maya clutched the files, her chest heaving. "Let's get out of here." Back in the lobby, they found Rachel and Ethan cornered, a tense standoff unfolding. Harris himself emerged from the shadows, his smug grin a grotesque mask of defiance. "You're all so predictable," he taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. "Did you really think you'd win?" Ethan's glare was molten. "You're done, Harris. This is your last pathetic gasp." Harris raised a gun, aiming it squarely at Maya, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Maybe," he sneered, "but I'll take her with me." Before he could fire, glass shattered with a piercing shriek. James Parker and a SWAT team rappelled through the courthouse windows, their weapons drawn, their shouts slicing through the chaos. "Freeze! Drop your weapon!" Parker bellowed. Harris's hand trembled, his bravado cracking for the first time, his eyes darting wildly. "You're surrounded," Parker pressed, his voice a steady anchor. "It's over." Harris snarled, but the fight drained from him as he let the gun fall, the clatter echoing in the sudden stillness. SWAT officers swarmed, cuffing him and his remaining men, their movements swift and precise. Maya clung to Ethan, her legs weak with relief as the adrenaline ebbed. "They came just in time," she whispered. Parker approached, his weathered face etched with grim satisfaction. "We've got it under control. You're safe now." In the aftermath, Harris and his cronies faced a litany of new charges: conspiracy, assault, attempted evidence tampering, each one a nail in the coffin of his empire. The files Maya had risked everything to save became the key to unraveling a broader network of corruption, sparking investigations that rippled through the police force like a tidal wave. Weeks later, at Harris's sentencing, the courtroom brimmed with a quiet resolve. The judge recited his crimes with methodical precision, each word a hammer striking down his legacy, culminating in a decades-long prison sentence. As Harris was led away in shackles, he shot Maya one final, venomous glare. "You'll regret this." He spat. She didn't flinch, her voice steady as stone. "I already regret not standing up sooner. But this ends now." With Harris behind bars, Maya, Ethan, Rachel, Emma, and Parker turned their sights on the bigger fight: systemic change. They drafted reforms, pushing for accountability and transparency, their shared resolve a beacon in the darkness. For Maya, it wasn't just about her own justice, it was about every soul crushed under the weight of corruption, every voice silenced by power. Months later, she stood before a roaring crowd at a rally, the wind tugging at her hair. Her heart full. "This isn't just my victory," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It's ours. Together, we can forge a future where justice isn't a distant dream, it's a reality we build." Brick by brick, the cheers that followed were a thunderous affirmation, a testament to the lesson etched into her soul. Power abused reaps its own ruin, and true justice, though hard won, endures. The air in the courtroom still buzzed with the echoes of triumph as Maya Carter and Ethan exchanged a subtle, knowing smile, their eyes reflecting a shared understanding that transcended words. They had taken the raw, jagged pieces of their suffering and molded them into something formidably a force for change. The sentencing of Harris, a corrupt official whose abuse of power had once seemed untouchable, wasn't just a personal victory, it was a crack in the foundation of a rotten system. The towering columns of the courthouse loomed behind them as they stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the steps. For Maya, though, this moment was no ending, it was a spark, a flare igniting a fire that demanded to be fed. She could feel it in her bones. The fight was only beginning. The revelations of widespread corruption had rippled outward, stirring a restless nation into action. And she knew this fragile momentum could slip away if they didn't seize it with both hands. In the weeks that followed, the city pulsed with a frenetic energy. A task force emerged from the ashes of the trial, a coalition of determined souls tasked with dismantling the failures it had laid bare. Maya threw herself into the work, her days a blur of meetings in dimly lit community centers and sleek government offices alike. She sat shoulder to shoulder with grassroots leaders whose voices trembled with passion, policymakers whose pens scratched furiously across legal pads, and principled officers like James Parker, a man whose weathered face betrayed years of silent frustration with the system he served. Together, they hammered out reforms that felt like lifelines tossed into a stormy sea. Mandatory body cameras to capture the unfiltered truth, an independent board to sift through allegations of misconduct, and a mandate for transparency in the murky financial dealings that too often grease the wheels of injustice. At every gathering, Maya's presence was a quiet storm, her voice steady as granite, her resolve unyielding. During one tense debate, the room thick with skepticism, she leaned forward, her hands pressed against the table. "These aren't just policies scribbled on some forgotten page," she said, her words cutting through the murmur of doubt. "They're the difference between suffocation and survival for people who've been crushed under the weight of unchecked power. This isn't about dragging good officers through the mud, it's about dragging the bad ones into the light and giving trust a chance to grow again." Her eyes burned with conviction, and even the most hardened cynics shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Outside those meeting rooms, the streets thrummed with defiance. Protests swelled, a tide of voices rising from cracked sidewalks and graffiti-streaked walls, demanding accountability. The resistance from those who clung to their old privileges was fierce whispers in backrooms, threats veiled as bureaucracy, but the roar of the public was a force they couldn't drown out. Maya's name began to echo through those crowds, a symbol of grit and hope stitched into banners and chanted in unison. Then came the day the city council chambers fell silent, the air heavy with anticipation as the mayor's pen scratched across the first wave of reforms. Maya stood beside James Parker, the flash of cameras bathing them in a staccato glow. She felt the weight of every battle that had brought her here, every sleepless night, every tear shed in silencing. When she faced the swarm of reporters, her voice rang clear. "This is only the starting line," she said, her chin lifted. "Real change doesn't bloom overnight. It's a slow, stubborn thing. But today, we've planted the seed." The crowd outside erupted, their cheers a thunderclap rolling through the streets. From that victory, Maya and Ethan poured their restless energy into something tangibly lifeline of their own making. The Carter Initiative for Justice rose from their shared vision, a non-profit built to cradle victims of police violence in their darkest hours and arm the next generation with the tools to unravel systemic wrongs. It grew roots fast, its offices buzzing with counselors offering solace, lawyers untangling legal knots, and scholarships lifting students toward careers that could rewrite the future. Maya was everywhere, her days spent with grieving families, her evenings lost to workshops where she poured her wisdom into eager activists. One humid night, she stood in a cramped community center, the air thick with the scent of sweat and determination. The folding chairs were packed with faces, some etched with fury, others softened by fragile hope. A young woman rose, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her seat. "Dr. Carter," she began, her voice a thread about to snap. "How do we keep going when it feels like the world won't budge?" Maya met her gaze, and for a moment, the room faded. She saw herself in that girl's fear. The fire in her answer came steady, warm with empathy. "Change is a brutal, patient beast. It doesn't bow to us on command, and it doesn't care how tired we get. But every word you speak, every stand you take, every inch we claw forward, it's a brick in something bigger. Look at this room. We're not fighting alone anymore. Together, we're unstoppable." The young woman's eyes glistened, and a murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ethan, meanwhile, carved his own path through the shadows of their mission. He became the backbone of the initiative, his nights swallowed by spreadsheets and phone calls to donors who could fuel their dreams. In the quiet hours, when exhaustion gnawed at them both, he'd catch Maya's eye over a sea of papers and grin faintly. "We're not just patching up the wounds of injustice anymore," he'd say, his voice rough with fatigue but alive with purpose. "We're building a world where those wounds don't have to happen." His words anchored her, a reminder of why they pressed on when the weight felt unbearable. But the road wasn't smooth. Harris's old cronies slithered out of the woodwork, their venom dripping through rumors and smear campaigns. Anonymous letters arrived, their words jagged with threats: "Back off, or else." Maya's hands shook as she read them, but her jaw tightened with every line. At a press conference, flanked by microphones and flashing lights, she faced the storm head-on. "To anyone who thinks fear will gag me," she said, her voice a blade slicing through the tension, "listen close. I've stared down worse than your cowardice, and I'm still standing. Your threats don't scare Methy, light a fire under me." The crowd roared, their applause a shield around her, and from the sidelines, Ethan watched, his chest swelling with pride even as worry creased his brow. Emma Lane, the journalist whose relentless digging had first cracked Harris's foyer, stood steadfast by Maya's side. Her sharp eyes glinted as she leaned in one afternoon, her voice low and fierce. "They're terrified of you, Maya, and they damn well should be. You've rewritten the rules they thought they owned." Her words were a spark, fanning Maya's resolve into a blaze. Months later, that fire carried her to a sprawling city park, where a sea of people stretched before her, families clutching signs, activists with fists raised, survivors whose scars mirrored her own. The air crackled with a restless hope as a banner fluttered behind her, its bold letters proclaiming justice for all, building a better tomorrow. She took a deep breath, the weight of 1,000 gazes settling on her, and when she spoke, her voice soared. "Thank you," she began, letting the words hang heavy in the air. "Thank you for standing with me, for believing justice isn't some fairy tale we tell ourselves. It's a need, a right, a fight worth having." She paused, her eyes tracing the crowd, each face a thread in the tapestry of their struggle. "When I started this, I was alone. Fear chewed at me, pain drowned me, anger owned me. But today, I see an army of people who won't let terror or hate write our story. We've climbed a mountain, but there's a range ahead. Together, we can make sure no one else bleeds like we did. Together, we can build a system that doesn't just shield the powerful, it lifts everyone." The cheers crashed over her like a wave, and Ethan joined her on stage, his arm a steady anchor round her. "We did this," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. She smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "And we're nowhere near done." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the park in hues of amber and violet, Maya lingered at its edge. The fight had carved its marks into hirashes in her bones, shadows in her dreams, but it had also forged a purpose that burned brighter than the pain. James Parker approached, his usual stoic mask softened by a rare, crooked smile. "You've lit a fire in a lot of us, Maya," he said, his voice gravelly with respect. "Even me." She turned to him, her expression earnest. "You've carried this as much as I have, James. Don't sell yourself short." He nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes, and asked, "What's next?" She gazed at the city skyline, its lights winking against the dusk. "We keep pushing. There's still so much broken, So many people waiting. But for once, I believe we can fix it. Their journey stretched on, an unfinished song, but the tide was turning. The system that had crushed so many was buckling under the weight of its own reckoning. Their scars whispered of the price they'd paid, but their spirits stood tall. As they walked to their car, hand in hand, Maya glanced back at the fading crowd. "Do you think we'll ever see a day when this is just history?" Ethan asked, his voice soft with wonder. She squeezed his hand, her answer steady. "Maybe not while we're here, but every step we take pulls it closer, and that's enough for me." Their story was a vivid lesson etched in sweat and sacrifice. Justice isn't a gift bestowed from on high, it's a garden cultivated through relentless courage and collective will. When power is abused, it festers, poisoning everything it touches. But when people rise to hold it accountable, the ground shifts. Maya and Ethan had turned their wounds into a rallying cry, proving that even the deepest injustices can't withstand the slow, unshakable force of those who refuse to break. The afternoon sun hung lazily over Maple Avenue, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk where Martha Johnson walked, her steps slow but purposeful. In her hands, she clutched a worn Bible, its leather cover softened by decades of devotion. She was dressed in her Sunday best, a modest floral dress and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her weathered face from the glare. At 73, Martha carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen the world change around her, yet held firm to her roots. This was her neighborhood, her home for over 40 years, a place where every corner held a memory. But today, those familiar streets felt foreign, hostile even, as the sharp voice of Officer Derek Carter sliced through the stillness. "Hey, you," he called, his tone clipped and accusatory, as though she were some stray object cluttering his view. "This isn't exactly the kind of place you'd expect to see someone like you just wandering around. Got ID?" The words landed like a physical blow, stinging Martha's pride. She stopped in her tracks, blinking rapidly as her mind raced to process the insult. "Someone like me," the phrase echoed in her head, stirring a mix of confusion and indignation. Her lips parted, and she straightened her spine, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Officer, I've lived here for over 4 decades. My house is just a blocks that way." She pointed with a trembling finger, her gaze unwavering. Derek, a broad-shouldered man in his early 30s with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl, didn't budge. He crossed his arms over his chest, his stance widening as if bracing for a fight. His uniform gleamed under the sunlight, the badge on his chest catching the light like a taunt. "Uh-huh," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Well, I'm still gonna need to see some identification. We've had reports of suspicious activity around here." His eyes narrowed, sizing her up as though she were a puzzle he didn't trust. Martha's brows furrowed, her disbelief swelling into something sharper. Suspicious activity? The absurdity of it churned in her gut. She tightened her grip on the Bible, its weight grounding her as she fought to keep her composure. "I just came from church," she said, her voice rising slightly with incredulity. "I'm holding a Bible, for goodness sake." She held it up, as if its presence alone should dispel any doubt. Derek's lips twitched into a smirk, the corner of his mouth curling upward in a way that made Martha's stomach twist. "Look, ma'am," he said, leaning in slightly, his tone patronizing. "I'm just doing my job. You can either show me some ID, or we can take this downtown. Your choice." His words carried a casual menace, a flex of power that felt unnecessary and cruel. Across the street, a small crowd began to form, drawn by the escalating tension. Neighbors peeked from behind faded curtains, their faces etched with curiosity and unease. A young man in a gray hoodie, no older than 20, pulled out his phone and started recording. His camera trained on the scene. Martha caught his movement out of the corner of her eye, and a pang of embarrassment stabbed at her. She didn't want her quiet Sunday walk turned into a public spectacle. "I don't carry ID when I go to church," she explained, forcing her voice to remain even. "But I can give you my name and address if that'll help." Derek let out a dramatic sigh, rolling his eyes as though she were a child testing his patience. "Yeah, that's not gonna cut it," he said, his voice thick with disdain. "You could be anyone, ma'am." The way he said ma'am felt like a mockery. A deliberate jab at her age and vulnerability. Martha's patience, already worn thin, began to fray at the edges. She took a deep breath, her chest tightening with frustration. "Officer, I'm a 73-year-old woman walking home from church in my own neighborhood. Do I really look like a threat to you?" His eyes flicked to the Bible in her hands, then back to her face. The smirk faded, replaced by a cold, unyielding stare. "I don't know, ma'am," he said, his voice hardening. "Maybe you're hiding something under that Bible, or maybe you're casing houses. I've seen all kinds of tricks." The accusation hit her like a punch, knocking the air from her lungs. Martha's jaw clenched, her fingers digging into the Bible's cover as anger flared within her. "This is harassment," she said, her voice rising, sharp and clear, "and you know it." Derek stepped closer, invading her space with deliberate intent. His shadow loomed over her, and she could smell the faint tang of his aftershave. "Harassment," he repeated, his tone mocking, his lips curling into a sneer. "Lady, you don't know the first thing about harassment, but if you keep running that mouth, you're about to find out." His words dripped with venom, a threat wrapped in bravado. The crowd across the street stirred, their murmurs of disapproval growing louder. The young man with the phone shouted, "Hey, man, leave her alone. She didn't do anything." His voice cracked with youthful defiance, but it carried across the distance. Derek whipped his head around, his hand hovering near the holster on his hip. "Mind your own business," he barked, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "This doesn't concern you." Martha took a cautious step back, her heart pounding against her ribcage. She could feel the anger boiling inside her, hot and fierce, but she also knew it wouldn't serve her here. She had to stay calm, had to think clearly. "Officer," she said, forcing her voice to soften. "Please, let me explain." "Hands where I can see them," Derek snapped, cutting her off. His voice was loud, commanding, edged with aggression. Martha's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "Excuse me," she said, stunned. "You heard me," he growled. "Put the Bible down and raise your hands. Now." The sheer absurdity of the demand crashed over her like a tidal wave. Here she was, a grandmother in her Sunday dress, being treated like a dangerous felon in the middle of her own street. She glanced at the young man filming, his phone still pointed at her, and a sudden spark of defiance ignited within her. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Derek's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing into slits. "What did you just say?" "I said no," Martha repeated, louder this time, her resolve hardening. "I will not be treated like a criminal when I've done nothing wrong." The words felt heavy, powerful, as they left her lips, a declaration of her dignity in the face of his tyranny. Derek's hand moved to his gun, and Martha froze, her breath hitching. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he warned, his voice low and menacing. Her mind raced harder for who, for her, standing her ground, or for him, clinging to his fragile authority. Before she could respond, a deep, resonant voice cut through the tension like a blade. Harder for who everyone turned, heads swiveling toward the source. Marcus Johnson stepped out of an unmarked police SUV, his presence as commanding as a storm rolling in. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, his polished shoes glinting in the sunlight, a stark contrast to Derek's rumpled uniform. At 44, Marcus carried the weight of his position as police chief with a calm authority. But now, as his eyes locked on Derek, then shifted to his mother, his face was a mask of disbelief and barely contained fury. "Mama," he said, his voice thick with shock and concern as he strode toward her. Martha exhaled, relief flooding her body like cool water on a parched day. "Marcus," she breathed, her voice trembling slightly. Derek's gaze darted between them, confusion dawning on his face. "Wait, you do know each other?" he stammered, his bravado faltering. Marcus ignored him, closing the distance to his mother in long, purposeful strides. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but urgent, his hands hovering near her shoulders as if afraid to touch her and break the fragile moment. "I'm fine," Martha said, though her voice wavered with the strain of the encounter. "But this officer seems to think I don't belong in my own neighborhood." Marcus's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his skin as he turned to Derek. His expression hardened into something fierce, unyielding. "Officer Carter," he said, his voice clipped. Would you care to explain why you're harassing an elderly woman in broad daylight? Derek's arrogance crumbled, his shoulders slumping slightly. Sir. I didn't know she was," he began, fumbling for words. "Didn't know she was what?" Marcus snapped, his tone cutting like a whip. "A citizen, a human being. Or is it just that you didn't know she was my mother?" His eyes bored into Derek, who opened his mouth but found no defense to offer. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, controlled calm. "You're done," he said, each word deliberate. "Turn in your badge and gun. Now." The crowd erupted in cheers, a wave of applause rippling through the onlookers. But Marcus didn't hear it. His focus remained on his mother, who stood tall despite the ordeal, her chin lifted with quiet strength. "Mama," he said softly, offering his arm. "Let's get you home." Martha nodded, tears welling in her eyes as the weight of the moment settled over her. "Thank you, son," she whispered, taking his arm. As they walked away, Derek stood rooted to the spot, the reality of his actions and their consequence finally sinking in. His hand lingered near his holster, but it was useless now. The power he'd wielded so carelessly had slipped through his fingers, leaving him exposed and alone. Within hours, the shaky footage captured by the young man in the hoodie spread like wildfire across social media, local news, and even national headlines. It showed Martha Johnson, resolute and unbowed, refusing to bend to Derek Carter's baseless demands. It showed Derek's hand on his gun, a chilling escalation, and then Marcus Johnson, the chief of police, stepping in with righteous fury to end it all. By morning, Havenwood buzzed with the story, debated in diners, whispered in church basements, dissected at the community center. To some, Marcus was a hero, a beacon of justice who'd struck a blow against the systemic abuses that festered in their town. To others, particularly within the police force, he was a traitor who'd humiliated them on a public stage. Martha, though, wanted none of it. She sat at her kitchen table, the same sturdy oak slab she and her late husband had bought nearly 40 years ago, staring at an untouched cup of tea. The faint hum of the television drifted in from the living room, a news anchor's voice recounting the incident. Local police chief Marcus Johnson made waves yesterday when he took swift action against Officer Derek Carter, caught on video threatening Johnson's own mother. Martha sighed, turning her head to gaze out the small window above the sink. The last thing she wanted was to be a symbol, a spectacle. For years, she'd poured herself into quiet acts of service, organizing food drives, mentoring troubled teens, hosting prayer circles. Her life had been steady, predictable, until Derek Carter's shadow fell across her path. The front door creaked open, pulling her from her thoughts. Marcus stepped inside, his tall frame filling the doorway. He looked exhausted, his suit wrinkled, his tie askew, dark circles shadowing his eyes. "Mama," he greeted softly, closing the door behind him. Martha turned in her chair, studying him with a mother's keen eye. "Marcus," she said, her voice gentle but laced with worry, "you look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," he admitted, setting his briefcase by the door. He crossed the room and sank into the chair across from her, resting his elbows on the table. "The department's been a mess since yesterday. 3 meetings just to deal with the fallout." He ran a hand over his face, and for a moment, he looked far older than his years. Martha frowned, her hands folding in her lap. "Who's coming for you?" she asked, sensing the weight he carried. "The union, some of the other officers, even a few city council members," he said, shaking his head. "They're saying I acted too fast, that I embarrassed the department, calling it a PR nightmare." She watched him carefully, her gaze steady. "You did the right thing, Marcus. That man had no business pulling his power like that. Justice isn't a PR gametes about what's right." He met her eyes, and for a moment, the hardness in his face softened. "I know, Mama," he said quietly, "but it's a lesson they'll never forget. Power's a dangerous thing when you forget who it's meant to serve." Martha nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Outside, the world buzzed with their story, but here, in the quiet of her kitchen, it was just the mother and son, bound by a shared understanding of what justice truly meant, and the steep price of standing for it. The air in the small kitchen hung heavy with unspoken tension. As Marcus sat at the weathered wooden table, his broad shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. His dark eyes traced the swirling patterns of the grain, each knot and line a silent witness to years of struggle he couldn't seem to unravel. If they can't see that pointing a gun at me or anyone else is wrong, then shame on them, he muttered, his voice low and bitter, tinged with a weariness that went beyond his 38 years. A faint, humorless chuckle escaped his lips, more a release of frustration than amusement. You really think they give a damn about justice, Mama? All they care about is covering their own backs. That's the rotten core of it. Across from him, Martha sat with the quiet strength of a woman who had weathered storms most could only imagine. Her warm, steady hand reached out, resting gently over his clenched fist, a lifeline in the chaos swirling inside him. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice a soothing balm against the raw edge of his anger. "You've been hauling this fight around like a sack of bricks for too long. You can't mend the world in a single night, baby." Her touch grounded him, pulling him back from the abyss of his thoughts, but his head snapped up, eyes locking with hers, fierce and unyielding. "It's not just about me, Mama. What happened yesterday wasn't some lone wolf cop losing his temper. It's the whole damn system, the way they're trained, the way they think. It's cracked straight through, and no matter how hard I shove against it, I'm out here swinging alone." Martha's gaze softened, her deep brown eyes shimmering with a mix of pride and sorrow. "You're not alone, Marcus. You've got this whole community holding you up, and you've got Mealways." Her words were a quiet promise, but Marcus only nodded, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't voice. He glanced down at his hands, raw, calloused, scarred from years of labor and battles fought, and a sharp pang of guilt twisted in his chest. His mother had already endured a lifetime of hardship, raising him alone after his father's death, scraping by in a world that rarely offered kindness to people like them. The last thing he wanted was to drag her into the mire of his crusade. As if she could hear the storm raging in his mind, Martha's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "This isn't my first dance with trouble like this, you know." Marcus's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face as he looked up at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening ever so slightly round the edge of the table, as if steadying herself against memories she'd long buried. "Your father and we had our own tangles with the police, back in the day," she said, her voice dipping into a quieter register, heavy with the weight of the past. "It's part of why we uprooted everything and came to Heavenwood. We wanted to shield you, give you a shot at a life free from all that ugliness." Marcus frowned deeper, the revelation hitting him like a punch to the gut. His father had passed when he was barely 16, a quiet man whose stories of struggle had faded with him. His parents had always been tight-lipped about their early years, and now he wondered how much they'd hidden to protect him. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" he asked, his tone laced with a mix of hurt and curiosity. Martha shrugged, her shoulders lifting slightly as if to shake off the question. "What good would it have done? We survived, that's what counted." She paused, her eyes searching his face, tracing the lines of exhaustion etched there. "But maybe we should have told you. Maybe then you'd have seen why this fight of yours burns so bright in you." A lump swelled in Marcus's throat, choking back the words he wanted to say. Instead, he reached out, his rough hand enveloping hers, squeezing gently as a silent vow passed between them. The moment hung fragile and tender until a sharp rap at the door shattered it. Martha's head tilted toward the hallway, her brow creasing with unease. Who could that be at this hour? Marcus stood, his chair scraping against the worn linoleum. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice firm as he strode to the door. When he swung it open, a young black man stood on the porch, a camera dangling from his shoulder, his hoodie and jeans giving him the air of someone who blended into the background until he didn't. His hair was neatly trimmed, his posture tense but purposeful. Marcus recognized him instantly, the one who'd captured that damning video of Derek Carter's confrontation with Martha the day before. "Chief Johnson," the man said, his tone cautious but edged with resolve. "I'm sorry to barge in like this, but we need to talk." Marcus's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering in his chest. "About what?" The Mankalub, Marcus would later learn, cast a quick, nervous glance over Marcus's shoulder, as if expecting someone to be listening. "About the department, about what's really going on behind those locked doors, Marcus stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft click. "Stop dancing around it," he said, crossing his arms over his chest, his stance unyielding. Caleb shifted his weight, clearly uneasy but pressing forward. "I've been filming police activity in Heavenwood for months. Derek Carter wasn't the only one stepping over the line. There's a whole crew of them. I've got footage, records, everything." Marcus's stomach twisted, a cold dread settling in his bones. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Caleb met his gaze, his voice dropping to a raw, honest edge. "Because I didn't think you'd care. But after what you did yesterday for Carter, figured maybe you're not like the rest." Marcus studied him, weighing the tremor in his voice against the fire in his eyes. After a long beat, he nodded. "Come back tomorrow. Bring everything you've got. If you're straight with me, we'll deal with it." Relief flashed across Caleb's face, a quick, fleeting thing. "Thank you, Chief." As he turned and disappeared into the dusk, Marcus lingered on the porch, the cool evening air doing little to calm the tempest brewing in his mind. The storm he'd been fighting was bigger than he'd ever imagined, and it was only just beginning. When he stepped back inside, Martha looked up from the table, her expression a silent question mark. "Who was it?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. Marcus hesitated, the weight of Caleb's words pressing down on him. "Just someone tossing more logs on the fire," he said finally, his tone cryptic. Martha's face tightened, but she didn't push. Instead, she reached for her chipped teacup, lifting it to her lips with deliberate slowness, the steam curling upward like a ghost of their shared past. "Then I reckon we'd better brace ourselves," she said quietly, her words hanging in the air like a battle cry. Marcus nodded, his jaw clenching with resolve. "Yeah, Mama, we better." The next morning, Marcus sat behind his desk at the Heavenwood Police Department, the room cloaked in an unnatural stillness that made his skin prickle. A stack of untouched reports loomed before him, their crisp edge mocking his inability to focus. The usual hum of activity ringing phones, officers trading barbs. The clatter of keyboard had faded into a muted hush, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He'd walked in that morning to a gauntlet of stairs that lingered too long, whispers that died the moment he turned his head. The chaos in his department was palpable, a living thing gnawing at the edges of his control. Firing Derek Carter had been a no-brainer if man's actions were indefensible. But the aftermath was a beast he hadn't prepared for. Union reps had already fired off an email dripping with indignation, questioning his judgment and authority. Officers he'd once counted as allies now eyed him with a cold, veiled hostility that stung more than he cared to admit. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as his thoughts spiraled. And now this kid Caleb. That was his name. Had dropped a bomb that made the rot in his department seem like a festering wound. He'd been too blind to notice. A knock at the door jolted him upright. "Comin'," he called, his voice rough with fatigue. The door creaked open, and Caleb stepped inside, a bulky backpack slung over one shoulder. His eyes darted nervously around the room, but there was a steely determination in the set of his jaw that Marcus couldn't help but respect. "Chief Johnson," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Caleb, right?" Marcus asked, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Yeah," Caleb replied, easing the backpack to the floor and sinking into the seat. "Thanks for seeing me." Marcus leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, his gaze piercing. "You said you had something to show me. Let's see it." Caleb nodded, unzipping his bag with a quick, practiced motion. He pulled out a battered laptop and a thick folder bulging with papers, setting them on the desk with a soft thud. "I've been tracking misconduct in your department for a while," he began, his words measured but urgent. "At first, it was small stuff, cops hassling people for no reason, treating certain blocks like war zones. But then I saw the pattern. The same names kept popping up. Derek Carter was just the tip of it." Marcus's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking in his cheek. "Who else?" Caleb slid the folder across the desk, his fingers lingering on it for a moment as if reluctant to let it go. "These are incident reports, complaints from inside, even some emails I dug up. There's a clique of officers who've been running their own game. They call themselves the Hunters. They target folks in the community, mostly young black guys. trying to pin them with anything they can, no matter how petty. Marcus flipped through the pages, his stomach churning as the evidence unfolded before him. Trumped-up charges, excessive force detailed in cold, clinical language, racial slurs scrawled casually in reports like they were nothing. His department, one he'd poured years into purging of corruption, was a cesspool, and he'd been too caught up in the day-to-day to see it. Caleb's voice dropped, quieter now but no less intense. There's more. I've got video stops where they're not just profiling, they're brutalizing people. And they've been covering each other's tracks the whole time. Marcus's grip on the papers tightened, the edges crumpling under his fingers. You're telling me this has been happening right under my nose? Caleb hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I don't think you knew. But plenty of others did, and they turned a blind eye. Marcus sank back in his chair, his mind reeling as the scope of it all crashed over him. This wasn't just about Derek Carter. This was a cancer eating at the heart of everything he'd sworn to protect. If he didn't act now, he'd be no better than the ones who'd looked away. Later that day, he sat with Martha at the dining table, the weight of Caleb's revelations pressing down on him like a physical force. She watched him in silence, her presence a steady anchor as he wrestled with the turmoil inside. I don't know how I let this happen, Mama, he said at last, his voice thick with frustration and a creeping despair. I thought I was getting somewhere, fixing things, but now I find out there's a whole pack of them in my department, hurting people, terrorizing the man. I didn't even see it. Martha reached across the table, her hand finding his, her touch as warm and unwavering as ever. You're one man, Marcus. One man can't heal a system that's been broken for generations. His voice rose, sharp with desperation. But I'm the chief. It's my job to stop this. My responsibility. Martha's eyes softened, her gaze cutting through his anger to the wounded core beneath. You saw enough, baby. You saw enough to start fighting. That's more than most. Her words settled over him, heavy with truth. And for the first time that day, he felt the flicker of something like hope. Justice wasn't a straight line. It was a war, fought inch by inch. And the cost of power misused, the wreckage left by those like the Hunters, only steeled his resolve to keep pushing, no matter how steep the climb. Marcus sat alone at his kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the scratched wooden surface. His fingers traced absent circles on the edge of his coffee mug, now cold and untouched. The weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders, his thoughts a chaotic storm swirling in his mind. Earlier, a young man named Caleb had come to him, his voice trembling but resolute, carrying a burden of evidence that could shatter everything Marcus had worked to uphold. Caleb's dark eyes had burned with a quiet faith, a belief that Marcus, unlike so many others in his position, would act with integrity. That trust gnawed at him now, a sharp ache in his chest. Most men in power, he knew, would turn away from such a plea, content to let the rot fester beneath the surface. But Caleb's conviction had pierced through Marcus's defenses, leaving him restless and unsettled. The thing is, Mama, Marcus said, his voice low as he glanced across the table at Martha, his mother, who sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her weathered face was etched with concern, her eyes searching his as if she could already sense the turmoil brewing inside him. Caleb's evidence site's not flimsy, it's ironclad. If I push this forward, it's going to tear the department to pieces. The union will come after me with everything they've got. The city council will lean on me to sweep it under the rug. And those officers, they won't just roll over and take it. They'll fight dirty. His words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken question he couldn't bring himself to voice. Was it worth it? Martha nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer right away, but the understanding in her gaze told him she saw the answer etched into the lines of his furrowed brow, the tension in his clenched jaw. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, the sky outside the Havenwood police station thick with clouds that mirrored the unease settling over Marcus. He called an emergency meeting with his senior staff, his voice steady over the phone despite the tremor of doubt in his gut. As they filed into the conference room, the air crackled with tension. Some avoided his eyes, their heads bowed as they shuffled to their seats, while othersmen he'd once called allies met his gaze with barely concealed hostility, their stares sharp as knives. Marcus stood at the head of the table, a towering figure in his crisp uniform, the stack of Caleb's documents resting like a loaded weapon before him. He drew a deep breath, the sound loud in the stifling silence, and began. "I've called you all here because something critical has come to light," he said, his tone firm but laced with an undercurrent of resolve that surprised even him. "I've got evidence hard. Undeniable proof that a group of officers in this department has been crossing lines they shouldn't. Racial profiling, excessive force, falsified reports. It's been happening right under our noses, and I'm not going to let it slide." A ripple of unease spread through the room, a low murmur of disbelief and defiance. Captain Jenkins, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetual scowl, leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. "Chief, if this is about Derek Carter, that mess was already dealt with. No point in stirring the pot again." His voice was gruff, dismissive, but Marcus caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. "It's not just Carter," Marcus snapped, his tone cutting through the air like a whip. "This runs deeper McDeeper, and I'm done standing by while it festers." Jenkins's frown deepened, his thick brows knitting together. "With all due respect, Chief, this department's already under a microscope. You start digging like this, it's going to look like a witch hunt. You'll tank morale, and the public will eat us alive." Marcus's eyes narrowed, a spark of anger flaring in his chest. "What's going to tank this department is pretending nothing's wrong. We can't fix what we won't face. Justice doesn't bend for convenience, Jenkins." His words landed like a blow, and the room fell silent, the weight of them pressing down on every soul present. Lieutenant Perez, a weary woman with sharp features and a reputation for playing it safe, spoke up next, her voice cautious but edged with warning. "Chief, if you take this public, the union's going to hit back hard. They'll spin it, make you the villain. You ready for that?" Marcus met her gaze, unflinching. "I didn't take this job to polish my reputation, Perez. I took it to protect this community. If that means I'm the bad guy to some, so be it." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating, as his team absorbed the gravity of his choice. He could feel the shiftalliances fraying, enemies forming, but there was no turning back now. The lesson was clear. Power without accountability was a poison, and he'd be damned if he let it spread further on his watch. That evening, Marcus sat in his dimly lit office, the hum of the station fading into a distant buzz. His phone vibrated against the desk, jolting him from his thoughts. A text from Caleb glowed on the screen. "There's more you need to see. Meet me tonight at the community center." A cold knot twisted in Marcus's stomach, a premonition of something darker looming on the horizon. He grabbed his coat, the fabric heavy in his hands, and stepped into the night, each footfall on the pavement echoing with a growing sense of dread. When he reached the community center, Caleb stood waiting, his slight frame hunched over a laptop. The young man's face was drawn, his usual fire dimmed by something heavier, fear, perhaps, or resignation. "What's this about?" Marcus asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. Caleb hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed play. The screen flickered to life, revealing a grainy video that sent a chill racing down Marcus's spine. The images were shaky but unmistakable. A group of officers, their faces lit by the harsh glow of a street lamp, laughing as they pinned a young man to the ground. Their taunts rang out, cruel and unrestrained, while the victim's muffled cries barely pierced the noise. Derek Carter was there, his smirk unmistakable. But it was the voice behind the camera that froze Marcus's blood low. Commanding tone of Captain Jenkins, urging them on with a glee that bordered on sadistic. This wasn't just misconduct. It was a conspiracy, a web of corruption stretching higher than Marcus had dared to imagine. The fallout from that night spiraled beyond anything Marcus could have predicted. The video, first leaked by an anonymous source, exploded across social media, igniting a firestorm that swept through Havenwood and beyond. News vans clogged the streets outside the police station, their lights casting an eerie glow through the windows. Reporters shoved microphones at anyone in uniform, their questions relentless. Outside City Hall, activists gathered in droves, their voices rising in a chorus of outrage that echoed through the downtown core. Inside the department, the air grew toxic, thick with suspicion and resentment. Marcus sat at his desk, staring at a growing pile of complaints, decades of buried grievances now clawing their way to the surface, each one a testament to the cost of unchecked power. His assistant, Paula, stepped into the room, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a tightness that mirrored his own. She clutched a folder, her knuckles white. "Chief, you need to see this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "What now?" Paula hesitated, then handed him the file. "It's from Internal Affairs. Derek Carter's record. It's worse than we thought." Marcus flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages as his jaw tightened. 6 complaints of excessive force stared back at him, one involving a teenage boy left battered and hospitalized. Yet every incident had been buried. Carter shuffled between precincts, his slate wiped clean. "Why am I just seeing this now?" Marcus demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Paula shifted, glancing nervously toward the door. "Because someone's been covering for Hyman, not just him. There's a pattern, Chief. A lot of these guys have scrubbed records." Marcus slammed the folder shut, fury boiling in his veins. "Who's behind it?" Paula's eyes darted around the room before she leaned closer. "We think it's Deputy Chief Randall." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Randall, a towering figure in the department, a man Marcus had known for decades, had always clung fiercely to the old ways. But this, shielding abusers, it was a betrayal that cut deep, a stark reminder that power could corrupt even those closest to you. Before Marcus could process the revelation, his phone buzzed again. The screen flashed a name that made his stomach lurch. "Anthony Lewis." He answered, his hand unsteady. "Chief Johnson," came Anthony's voice, calm but laced with steel. "We need to talk, in person, about your department and your father." The mention of his father sent a jolt through Marcus, confusion warring with dread. "What do you know about my father?" he asked, his tone sharp. "More than you think," Anthony replied. "Meet me at the community center. I'll lay it all out." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at the phone, his mind racing. At the community center, the air was thick with tension. Anthony stood by a folding table littered with papers, his arms crossed, his dark eyes locked on Marcus as he approached. Martha sat nearby, her presence a quiet enigma, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She'd insisted on coming, though Marcus couldn't fathom why not yet. "What's this about?" he demanded, his patience fraying. Anthony didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed Marcus a faded police report from 1985. The words swam before Marcus's eyes. "A young black man. David Lewis, Anthony's father, arrested on trumped-up charges. His life derailed by a lie. My father did 2 years because of this," Anthony said, his voice steady but simmering with old pain. "All because your father didn't show up to testify." Marcus's head snapped up, his breath catching. What are you saying?" Anthony's gaze didn't waver. "Your father was a witness. He saw it go down, knew the charges were garbage. But when it mattered, he stayed silent, and my father paid for it." Martha shifted, her voice soft but firm. "Anthony, that's enough." He rounded on her, his anger flaring. "No, it's not. He needs to hear this." Marcus turned to his mother, his heart pounding. "Mama, is this true?" Her shoulders sagged, her eyes dropping to her hands. "Your father wanted to speak up. He knew what they did to David was wrong. But then the threats came, real ones. Men at our door in the dead of night, saying they'd come for you if he talked." Her voice broke, a tear slipping down her cheek. "He couldn't risk you, Marcus." The revelation hit Marcus like a tidal wave, anger and grief crashing together in his chest. His father had chosen silence, letting an innocent man suffer to shield his family. It was a choice born of fear, but its consequences rippled through decades. A stark lesson in the price of cowardice and the enduring demand of justice. For Marcus, the path ahead was clearer than ever. He would not repeat that mistake, no matter the cost. The rot of power had festered too long, and he would root it out, piece by painful piece. Martha's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, her words barely above a whisper, heavy with the weight of years spent wrestling with her choices. "We were just trying to shield our family," she said, her eyes fixed on the worn wooden floor of the community center, as if it held the answers she'd been searching for. It wasn't something we decided lightly. Every night, I'd lie awake, torn between fear and duty, wondering if we were doing the right thing. But in the end, we did what we thought we had taught we believed would keep us all safe. Her hands twisted together in her lap, the lines on her face deepening with the memory of those sleepless nights, the quiet prayers she'd whispered into the darkness. Anthony stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the floor, his breath quickening as emotion surged through him. His voice rose, sharp and jagged, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "And in trying to save your own, you tore mine apart," he said, his eyes blazing with a fury that had simmered for years, now boiling over. "My father lost everything, his job, gone in an instant, his reputation, shredded by whispers and accusations, his freedom, locked away behind bars because of what your family set in motion. And you're standing there, telling me it's all justified because you were scared?" His fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving as he fought to keep his voice steady. The pain wasn't just in his words, it was in the way he stood, rigid and unyielding, a man carrying the wreckage of a life he'd once known. Marcus raised a hand, his movement slow but deliberate, a silent command for calm. "Enough," he said, his tone firm yet edged with exhaustion. He turned to Anthony, his face a mask of unreadable emotions, regret, resolve, and something deeper. Something that flickered in his dark eyes like a storm brewing on the horizon. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low but steady, each word measured as if he were stepping through a minefield. Inside, his mind churned. He'd spent years building walls around his conscience, telling himself he was doing his best in a broken system. But now, standing here, Anthony's anger crashed against those walls like waves against a crumbling cliff. "I want accountability," Anthony replied, his voice cutting through the tension like a gunshot. "I want you to fix what your father destroyed. This department's not just corrupt. It's been rotting from the inside for decades, a festering wound nobody's had the guts to cut open. You think firing one crooked officer is going to heal it? It's a bandage on a broken legit doesn't even scratch the surface." His gaze bore into Marcus, unrelenting, daring him to look away. In his mind, he saw his father's face, the man who'd once taught him to ride a bike now reduced to a shadow behind prison glass. The injustice of it burned in his chest, a fire that refused to die. Marcus's jaw tightened, the muscles twitching as he fought to keep his composure. Anthony's words stung, piercing through the armor of his authority, striking at the doubts he'd buried deep. "You think I don't see it?" he shot back, his voice rising despite himself. "You think I'm not trying to drag this place out of the muck? I'm clawing at it every day, Anthony, but it's like fighting quicksand." He paused, his breath ragged, the weight of his position pressing down on him. The documents scattered across the table behind him, yellowed complaints, sworn affidavits, internal memos stained with coffee ring told a story of betrayal he could no longer ignore. A culture of abuse, woven into the very fabric of the Havenwood Police Department, stared back at him. Finally, he nodded, a small, reluctant gesture. "I'll look into it," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the room's old heater. Anthony's eyes narrowed, his skepticism a tangible force. "You'd better do more than look, Chief," he said, his tone laced with both warning and desperate hope. "You've got a shot, hurry, a real shot-o, do something that matters. Don't let it slip through your fingers." He turned away, his shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him for the moment. But beneath the exhaustion, a flicker of belief lingered. Maybe, just maybe, Marcus could be the one to break the cycle. That night, Marcus sat alone in his office, the dim light of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. His gaze settled on the framed photo of his father, a stern figure in a crisp uniform, gazing out with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his path. For years, Marcus had revered him, seen him as the embodiment of strength and honor, a beacon to guide his own career. But now, that image felt brittle, cracked by the truths he could no longer deny. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and let Anthony's words replay in his mind, each one a hammer strike against the pedestal he'd built for his father. His own compromises haunted him too, the times he'd looked the other way, the deals he'd made to keep his head above water in a system that rewarded silence over justice. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as he wrestled with the man he'd become. Finally, he reached for the phone, his hand trembling slightly as he dialed. "Paula," he said when the line clicked, "get me everything we have on Deputy Chief Randall. Every report, every complaint, and pull the personnel files for every officer under him. I want to know who's been hiding in his shadow." His voice grew harder, more certain with each word. On the other end, Paula hesitated, her breath catching. "Are you sure, Chief?" This could turn into a war messy, ugly, and loud. Marcus's jaw clenched, his resolve hardening like steel. "It's already a war," he said. "We're just the ones finally showing up to fight. Let's clean it up." Outside, the Heavenwood Police Department buzzed with unrest. The protests had swelled, spilling beyond the chain-link fence that bordered the parking lot. Day after day, the crowd grew, angry voices rising in a chorus that echoed through the streets, their signs swaying like battle flags in the brisk March wind. Justice for all, end police abuse, hold them accountable. The chants drifted up to Marcus's window, faint but insistent, a constant reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just about Derek Carter anymore, the officer whose brutality on Maple Avenue had sparked the fire. It was about decades of wounds, families shattered, trust eroded, lives lost to a system that preached protection but delivered pain. Marcus stood there, hands clasped behind his back, watching the sea of faces below. Their anger mirrored his own, a quiet rage he'd suppressed for too long. Behind him, Paula shifted her weight, her heels clicking softly against the tile. "Chief, the mayor's on the line again," she said, her voice tight with unease. "She's pressing for your plan, says the city's on edge." Marcus didn't turn, his eyes still fixed on the crowd. "Tell her what I told her yesterday," he said, his tone flat but unyielding. "The plan's simple, clean house, and we start right now." Paula lingered, her fingers twisting the edge of her clipboard. "You know they'll push back, right? The union's already grumbling, the council's circling, and even some of the clean officers. They'll make this hell for you." Marcus finally faced her, his expression carved from stone, though his eyes burned with determination. "Let them try," he said. "I didn't sign up to play nice. I took this job to fix things, and if that means burning it all down and starting over, I'll light the match myself." Paula nodded, her worry etched into the lines around her mouth. But she didn't argue. "Press conference is in 20, she said. "You ready?" Marcus glanced back at the window, the protesters' voices growing louder. "I've been ready my whole life." The conference room at City Hall thrummed with energy, a chaotic tangle of reporters elbowing for space, their cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Martha sat in the front row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her presence a quiet anchor amid the frenzy. She'd lived through the worst of it, seen the batons fall, heard the cries of her neighbors, felt the sting of a system that turned its back on her family. Now, she watched her son with a mixture of pride and fear, knowing the road ahead would test him in ways she couldn't shield him from. At the back, Anthony leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face a mask of guarded hope. He didn't fully trust Marcusnet yet, but the man's actions since their clash at the community center had forced him to reconsider. Bold steps, risky ones, had been taken, and Anthony couldn't deny the shift in the air. Marcus stepped to the podium, adjusting the microphone with a steady hand. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over him like a mantle. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice ringing out clear and strong, cutting through the restless hum of the room. "For weeks, Heavenwood has been thrust into the spotlight, a national reckoning on what policing means in this country, and we deserve that scrutiny. What happened with Officer Derek Carter and my mother, Martha Johnson, wasn't a fluke. It was a flare, lighting up a problem that's festered far too long." He paused, letting the silence stretch, the gravity of his words sinking in. "This department has run wild for years, misconduct swept under rugs, bad cops shielded, and the people we vowed to protect left bleeding in the aftermath. That stops today." The room buzzed, pens scratching furiously as reporters leaned forward. "As of this morning," Marcus went on, "I've placed Deputy Chief Randall on administrative leave. We're digging into his role in burying misconduct, every cover-up, every lie. And I've ordered the release of a decade's worth of internal complaints, open to the public. Transparency isn't a buzzword. He reached the foundation we rebuild on. A reporter's hand shot up, her voice sharp. Chief Johnson, do you have proof Randall's dirty? Marcus met her gaze, unflinching. Yes, and if this investigation proves what we think, he'll answer for it. No badge makes you untouchable, not anymore. The murmurs swelled, a tide of shock and anticipation rippling through the crowd. He pressed on, his voice gaining strength. We're also launching a full overhaul: policies, training, discipline at top to bottom. And we're doing it with the community, with people like Anthony Lewis, who've held our feet to the fire. At his name, Anthony's eyebrow arched, surprise flickering across his face. He hadn't expected this, a public nod, a partnership, but he held his tongue, weighing the gesture. This is the start, Marcus said, his tone fierce with conviction. Change won't come fast or easy, but I swear this to you, as long as I'm chief, I'll fight to make this department fair, equal, and worthy of your trust. Questions erupted, a barrage of voices, but Marcus stepped back, his pulse pounding in his ears, his resolve a steel rod in his spine. He left the stage, the echoes of his words trailing behind him. That evening, Marcus sat on the sagging porch of his childhood home, the sunset painting the street in hues of amber and gold. Martha settled beside him, a chipped mug of tea cradled in her hands, steam curling into the cool air. They sat in companionable silence, the day's weight settling around them like a blanket. You did good today, she said at last, her voice soft but firm, a mother's reassurance. Marcus shrugged, his broad shoulders hunching slightly. Talk's cheap, mama. Making it Ralph, that's the battle. She reached over, her hand warm against his, her touch grounding him. You've already begun, son. That's more than most ever dare. He looked at her, his hard edges softening under her gaze. Thanks, mama, for everything, for holding us up when I couldn't. Her smile was faint but radiant, a flicker of light in the dusk. No thanks needed, baby. I'm just proud of who you are. The silence stretched again, comfortable and warm, as the streetlights buzzed to life. After a while, Marcus spoke, his voice tentative. You think Dad would have been proud? Martha's eyes dropped to her tea, her fingers tightening around the mug. She didn't answer right away, lost in memories of a man who'd been both hero and flawed human. Your father wasn't perfect, she said finally, her voice thick. He stumbled, made choices I'll never understand. But he loved this family, this town. He wanted it to be better. She looked up, tears glinting in her eyes. So yes, Marcus, I think he'd be proud. I'm proud. The words sank into him, heavy and bittersweet, a balm for the cracks in his heart. A week later, Marcus and Anthony stood shoulder to shoulder on the weathered steps of the community center, facing a crowd of residents, bathed in the glow of dusk. The air crackled with energy as they spoke, Marcus with measured fire, Anthony with raw urgency about the long road to accountability, the work still ahead, the power of unity in a fight that felt endless. As they finished, the crowd roared, applause rolling over them like thunder. Martha watched from the sidelines, her chest tight with emotion. For the first time in years, hope stirred within her, not just for her son, but for Havenwood itself. Change was creeping in, slow and grueling, but real. And this time, it carried the weight of truth, the sting of consequence, and the promise of a justice that wouldn't bend to power. The lesson was clear: when those entrusted with authority let it rot, the fallout scarred every one of it. In facing it head-on, redemption could begin.